Welcome to our final day of cultural humility and cultural competency. Um, we're almost there, and this has been such an interesting and exciting topic and conversation that we've had over the last few days. And we are finally finishing out today. I wanted to say for the folks who observe, acknowledgement of Good Friday. Thank you for joining us and just acknowledging that for the folks who observe. And my name is Dr. Dolores Blackwell, and my co-trainer is Miss Diana Padilla. And we're going to go through the rest of our content today. Before we get started, of course, we have to do our housekeeping. And our housekeeping is, as you are going through, please type in your name, your first and last name that you use to register for the training in the chat. Okay, type in your first and last name. And just a quick run through of just our quick Zoom thought processes, Zoom housekeeping. When you entered in, you were placed on mute. And so hopefully you will remain on mute unless you're unmuting yourself to answer a question, etc., or to respond. The chat function is available for you to respond not only to our team, but also each other. And it's been amazing reviewing the chat. It's been a great opportunity to really lean in to see how people are talking to each other, responding to each other, and responding to the material. So you can definitely continue to use that. Also, remember at the bottom of your screen is your reaction button. So you can raise your hand, you can do a thumbs up, you can do any number of things with your chat function. If for some reason you cannot be on camera, because we know that folks are in a variety of spaces and places and have the ability to bandwidth, etc., we're considering all of that. Just a reminder that if you cannot be on camera or if something is happening with your audio, etc., please type it in the chat so we can attempt to assist you on our end if we can. If we cannot, then we definitely understand, but just let us know in the chat function. So today we'll be going from approximately 9:30 or 9:30 to 1:30 today. And so we have a lot of material to cover today. And I hope that the conversation continues to be present. Okay, continues to be present because that's what helps drive this challenging journey that we're on. Today, we're finishing up day 3 of cultural humility and cultural competence. And so welcome back and thank you for again joining us. Okay, and so just a quick disclaimer of some material we just need to remind ourselves of that this is not a clinical training. We will not delve into clinical practices, concepts, or processes beyond the cultural competent and cultural humility considerations associated with it. This is not the end all, okay? So you will not be culturally competent after completing this training. There's a recognition that this is an ongoing journey so that there will be unfinished business after this training requiring you to really lean in and do some further learning, further research, etc. And that the personal truths expressed in this training by the facilitators and training participants are their truths respectively as they experience life and should be and must be met with respect. While we use a number of different terms related to clients in regards to participants, service members, etc., what we're utilizing for the purposes of this opportunity, this training space, is clients. And as we have continued to lean into throughout our other 2 days or the time we've been together, not getting caught up in politically correct or sanctioned language for certain field terms. We may use a common language used in communities of service, which may not necessarily be technical terms, okay? And so just to lay down, again, our ground space, kind of grounding the space to prepare for the material that we'll be leaning in today, some of the things we need to remind ourselves of, and we always need to remind ourselves of, is to listen to each other and respect each differences. We all have differences, different experiences, etc. How we perceive things. Okay, so really leaning in and listening to that. And there are times we're going to have to agree to disagree. That while folks may be expressing their opinions, their thoughts, etc., as they speak for themselves, the I statement, I feel that way. There may be things that folks may say in this space, in the chat that you may not agree with, but we can agree to disagree. What stays in this room or what happens in this virtual space stays in this space. And everyone makes an effort to contribute honestly and to share and deal with feelings in a positive fashion. And again, going back to expecting some unfinished business. We also want to recognize that any of this material at any given time can activate folks. And I use the word activation. That might be also recognized by folks as triggering, but I like the word activation, as that's what, as trauma folks, we're moving from that word. So if at any point you feel activated by any of the material, because we never know when that might happen, you can use the safety word ouch when the conversation is activated. Or if you're feeling overwhelmed, you can take a moment, breathe, step away, and just kind of ground yourself because this material can lead to some of that happening. So that is okay. We're hoping that this is a safe space, right? A safe space where folks can hold values, we can hold all perspectives as seen, being seen as valid, even though we may disagree with them. And you may find that, this is helpful to kind of maintain the integrity and safety of this space. So one of the things we definitely want to lean into is no racism, no sexism, or any of the isms, ableism, ageism, sizeism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, or fat phobia. We're engaging in no hate in this safe space. And so as we're asking everyone to actively listen and asking everyone to really connect to folks in their identified or preferred gender pronouns, etc., also recognizing that the use of potential stereotypical terms or terms that are potentially hurtful to other communities, etc., that we need to be mindful that as we are sharing our thoughts, our feelings, etc., to be mindful of taking that stereotype driven language off the table or out of that, okay? Because that's part of the learning space, okay? So some things that we're going to be talking about is we're going to take a couple of minutes just to reflect on where people are landing. And really, it is going to be just a few minutes because we definitely have a fairly robust agenda for today. We're going to be going into difficult conversations after some processing. We're going to be talking about racism, oppression, some anti-oppressive practices, cross-cultural communication, some effective tools for culturally responsive engagement. As I like to remind folks, this information may be information that you know from prior trainings or spaces, etc. And so just being mindful that for some folks, this may feel like a reminder. And for some folks, this may be brand new information, but we respect all of that in this training space. So I'd like to take about a good, let's take a couple of minutes. And when I say a couple of minutes, not two, but let's talk about this for about 7 minutes so we can get some sense or some reflection on where people are landing and how they're feeling, okay, about the material that we've covered thus far. Would anyone like to share or start? Let me check the chat to make sure. Okay, so I'm getting there's some love in the chat saying this is a great training, not a good training, a great training. So thumbs up on that. Thank you so very much. El Melida, please, again, if I mispronounced your name, I apologize. And you said to me the other day what to call you, so I apologize if I forgot. This is, it's just so much
It's
happening.
okay. It's a lot of people.
Thank
It's a
you.
lot of people. Yeah.
Would you like to share?
Yeah. It's you can first of all, it's easy to call me Air May. Air like you breathe, May like the month. So it makes it easy. But I've taken that there are just so many perspectives that people have shared. Like Oscar has shared stuff, and Thurston has shared stuff, and it really has been a diverse exchange of people and their opinions, and it widens that no matter where we are coming from, we all have these experiences that lean to our perceptions, and
Mhm.
there's this intersectionality that in one way, shape, or form, we benefit from this course. Because we might not see in ourselves, oh, I didn't realize I had that ism. I didn't realize I was triggered by microaggressions I may have experienced, and that has created a bias in me. Like it's been eye-opening in the sense that it's caused you to see, like, okay, I get tense around, you know white people. It's because microaggressions in the past and encounters in the past, but I have to be more relaxed. I can't be ready for confrontation the minute I see somebody wear, for example, and no offense to anyone, but the minute I see a Make America Great hat, I can't come to that assumption that, oh, this person is racist and naturally going to be hostile to me as an Afro Latina woman. I have to put that by to the side and go, okay, let's be relaxed. And so it's been interesting. It's been very interesting.
Thank you for that. And you bring up some great points around, and if it's okay, is it okay with you if I paraphrase just a bit?
Yes, go right ahead.
It sounds like it's recognizing what's you and what is potentially the other person, and how you may, or any of us may connect to somebody. We see someone, we have certain things that are activated for us, and taking a moment to ground ourselves before we respond. Because
Yes, yes.
yeah, because sometimes we're responding to something based upon our prior experiences, and it's almost, who's this person in front of me, and getting to know this person and reacting or responding to this person based upon who they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm,
Okay,
exactly.
awesome. Awesome. Thank you. Tatiana?
Yes, good morning, everyone. I just want to say for me, this has been very insightful and it has made me think a lot, not only about how I present myself as a person, but how I present myself to my clients and just realizing and remembering that everyone has their own stories and everyone comes with their own baggage, and to be mindful of the fact that language and being able to present yourself with a comfortable space. I'm not sure about everyone on the call, but we're in some way helping in the helping profession. And I feel like it's not only important just to be mindful of the work that we do with our clients, but to be mindful in practicing self-care as well, just because we all come from different institutions, and I feel like we have to allow not only space for our clients, but space for ourselves to like sit at the end of the day and just reflect and see that not only are we supporting clients with like resources and like other things like that, but we can also use them for ourselves if we feel that we have been activated, just like you said, Dr. Blackwell, and it's a great word and we'll be using that. But if you feel activated, to reach out to support systems, and if you feel comfortable in like your work environment, just to reach out to them as well to see how they can help you out in different spaces. And I apologize for being off camera today.
No worries, no worries. Thank you. I appreciate your comments. John,
Good morning.
good morning.
What are the, well, pictures you showed was showing the one person dressed in all different ways. And it's amazing how I looked at that picture and I didn't even see it was the same person until somebody mentioned it. And of course, I had different feelings and thoughts about each of those pictures, and it's the same exact. And I had a hoodie on. I, Look at you. We're gonna get pulled over. Put that hood down. What are you doing? People think you're up to and your background, and it's just things. It's amazing.
Thank you, John. I just wanted to just bring to just a flag that your audio is a little off, so there was some pieces of your statement that we didn't hear.
Oh,
But no worries. If you feel like there's more that you wanted to share, please feel free to put it in the chat, because I see a lot of folks are
well,
utilizing the chat to share, and that's good too. Let's go to Charmaine.
Hi, good morning, Godwa. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, so I love the strategy, the stigma reduction strategy. I sent in my homework this morning, so forgive me. But I do incorporate these styles in my counseling style, especially the education piece, choosing words carefully, and helping patients understand that this is a journey, it's a process. Forgiving themselves is very important because I think a lot of them are so stuck in the rumination of lack of self-forgiveness, things they did in the past. And and also to healing the inner child. I would love to see incorporated more in social services, the use of life coaches. Life coaches are very helpful in help, not telling you what to do, but helping you to take responsibility for the things that you have to change in your life and be gentle in your process and giving yourself grace and compassion along the journey. When you don't forgive yourself, give yourself grace and compassion, to climb the hill seems so much harder, you know? So I instill that. I give a lot of education about tips. I eat talking about your diets. You have to change your diet, the way how you eat, because sugars, a lot of them use a lot of sugar. So that's also giving them that dopamine effect, that high. So changing your diet, and like I showed one of the patients today, he's a chef. He went to school to be a chef. I said, great. And I showed him a little bit of my some creative ways how you can create things on social media just by being productive and creative with your time. Also, another one who is here, I encouraged him to get into talk therapy, and he said, I took your advice a couple of years ago, and it really helped me. So, there's betterhelp.com if you don't want to go in and see a therapist, but talk therapy is important to, unpack and release a lot of those things that we hold on and in our spirits and our heart and on our backs, to make the load lighter and to know that it's one day at a time, to be gentle with your process. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. We have time for about one more comment, and I think that Thurston, you had your hand raised. Definitely folks can continue to utilize the chat as an opportunity to share their thoughts about the content thus far, but we're definitely going to finish off with Thurston.
Yeah, I did, but I'm not sure. I think I wanted to kind of reflect on something that happened in another session. So I don't know if that's appropriate for now, or should I hold it?
Let's hold it and see.
Okay.
Okay, because it might be something that's resolved later on in some of the content that we're talking about. So it's
Sure.
definitely something that we can do. Okay.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you so very much. So thank you all. Continue to again use the chat, and I'm going to start us with our content today. And we're going to be leaning into the premise of difficult conversations, which is some of the underlying foundation of what we have been leaning into the last few days, right? Is having those difficult conversations, talking to folks, connecting to folks, what that looks like. And so we're going to be leaning into that content. So give me 1 second to share my screen and get myself sorted. So we're going to be talking about difficult conversations which impact every aspect of our lives. While we're leaning into this content for the purposes of cultural humility and cultural competency, we have difficult conversations with people across the board, whether it is clients, whether it is our family, friends, community members, etc. So this information or this kind of review can help in all of those types of conversations. And again, for some folks, it's a reminder. For some folks, it's food for thought for them to think about as we move forward. Okay. So when we talk about difficult conversations, a difficult conversation is anything you find hard to talk about due to the fear of consequence, right? Anything that we fear that consequence. How is someone going to respond to us? What is going to be activated for us? It could be fear of rejection. It can be fear of so many different things, but it's connected to fear of consequence, those difficult conversations. And we usually worry about what will happen if we talk about it, right? If we talk about it. And so if we do talk about it, we usually think and feel a lot more than we actually say, right? Because when we interact with folk, when we interact with clients, when we interact with anyone, during that conversation, it's a reciprocity, we hope. that we're saying something, we're sharing something, and they're sharing something in return. And so we really have to, sometimes think about what we're saying, how that person is responding to it. And many times when we walk away from those difficult conversations, we think, I should have said this, or I wasn't sure about this, etc. So really, we usually think and feel a lot more than what we actually say, because it can be seen as a protective factor for both folks involved in that conversation. So difficult conversations are challenging. They can be, they can have conflict. They can contain conflict. They could be fear, anger, frustration. It could be anger. It can be procrastination, disagreement, and misunderstanding. Okay, a difficult conversation can be those conversations that can trigger potentially defensiveness on the other person or trigger all of these different emotions. And that's why they're difficult. Okay. And so some ingredients of a difficult conversation include different perceptions, having different information about the same event or discussion. And sometimes we find that happening, right? Or even the different interpretations of the same information or decision or issue, or absolutely a different worldview, right? We could be making assumptions about intent, right? We think we know the intentions of others. And we need to really be very thoughtful about this when we're talking about difficult conversations, because we don't know intent. And so one of the things we want to lean into and ask about is, what is being communicated here? What, instead of making assumptions, right? We make a series of assumptions, and very often our assumptions are based upon the impact of the other person's actions on us. Okay. Oftentimes we feel slighted, and therefore we believe that they intend to slight us. And there goes that bumping of heads. Okay. So we really want to be thoughtful about our conversations, not necessarily make assumptions about intent. Ask people what they intend to communicate, because we have intent versus impact. We intended to communicate one thing, but it impacted the person the other, and it's vice versa. So really being very thoughtful about that, okay? The feelings and some other ingredients is being passionately involved. Our feelings are passionate. We feel strongly about what is happening here, okay? And so our feelings are usually the heart of the matter in a conflicting situation. And it can take in many forms, okay? So some of the forms are sarcasm, passive aggression, impatience, excuse me, etc. Or we can, take jabs at folks depending upon what's happening, okay? So being very thoughtful about in those difficult conversations, whether it is with clients, whether it is with folks in our world, being thoughtful about where our feelings are, and sometimes recognizing that sometimes we need to take a break and take a step back and say, wait a minute, something's happening here. Something is flaring up here potentially. How do I kind of put the brakes on this so that the intention and the impact match as best as possible? Okay. So there's also the components of blame, when the focus becomes who was wrong and who should be blamed for the problem, who made this mistake and who should apologize, and making judgments, right? So when we engage in these difficult conversations, right, there's a part of this whole win-lose. Someone may feel like they got to take the W and somebody's got to be the L, right? They got to take the losing position, right? Thinking about, do we need to have conversations in that way? And thinking about, rather, how do we each walk away from this conversation, this very challenging conversation, with a win-win, right? That we get what we need, whether it is validation, whether it is information, whether it is just processing something, etc. So moving away from that concept of somebody is a WL conversation to a win-win conversation as best that we possibly can. And so those three conversations can look like what happened, conversation or disagreement about what happened, right? That's sometimes, where we get to those difficult conversations. The feeling conversation, which is each conversation asks and answers questions about feeling, even if we don't bring that in, they're addressed, they're leaking in, right? Even if we don't, if they're not addressed, they leak in. The identity conversation, the conversation we have about with ourselves about what the situation means to us. And this very often determines if we're off-centered, anxious, or balanced. And so when you think about difficult conversations, if you're feeling, if there's a particularly strong feeling, or you're anxious, or you need answers, or you're feeling off center or not grounded, those identity conversations can be very challenging conversations. Okay. And sometimes we just have to say, you know what? Gotta wait to have this conversation, right? So what's the story here? The what happened conversation. Let's lean into that a little bit. The truth assumption, key assumption, I'm right, you're wrong, right? So if we move from that WL thought, somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose, maybe just saying, how can we both walk away from this conversation as best, as processed and as okay as we possibly can. WW conversations, win-win conversations. The intention invention, right? Key assumption, we know the intention of others, right? Or the blame frame, focusing significant attention on who's to blame. These conversations kind of under that umbrella of what happened, right? First of all, we don't know the intention of folks because we're not mind readers, right? None of us are. And so asking versus making assumption can kind of deconstruct some of the difficulty in that conversation. And also who's to blame. And that goes back to that somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose, right? If we focus on the blame, we're not focusing on how can we get past this? How can we figure out how this happened? Is this something that we can deal with and prevent this from potentially happening in the future? Versus, okay, it's your fault, or you're saying it's my fault. Okay, so really thinking about that. Okay. So the feelings conversation, which is another type of infused conversation in a difficult conversation space, kind of umbrella. So ignoring or refusing to acknowledge and deal with feelings, your own or the other person, is the most common mistake made in dealing with difficult conversations. What are your feelings? What are the other person's feelings? Acknowledging them and dealing with them, okay? A lot of times when we engage in these difficult conversations, we may walk away feeling like, I didn't feel heard. My feelings weren't respected, okay? And so imagine if you're having this difficult conversation, if each person's walking away feeling like their feelings were not heard, okay? So feelings are at the core of difficult conversations, and feelings can make relations enjoyable and satisfying, but also feelings are what makes difficult conversations difficult, okay? That's the core of a difficult conversation, right? The feelings, okay? So let's also lean into the identity conversation. So difficult conversations are not just difficult because we have to face the other person, right? Because we have to face the other person in regards to not just a physical conversation. That conversation could take any place over any spectrum. So we could be doing this telehealth, right? But we also have to face ourselves. When we lean into the identity conversation, it's about, am I a good person? Am I worthy of love, right? So those difficult conversations can threaten our identity. And leaning into that. And so going into those conversations, right? Also connecting to that and saying, am I a good person? Am I worthy of love? Am I worthy of care? Am I competent enough to work with this client? Am I competent enough to hear their narrative, hear their story, and take that information in? Okay. All of these are potential moving pieces under the identity conversation. So starting the difficult conversation, which again is not always an easy thing, or otherwise it wouldn't be a difficult conversation. So where do we begin with this? We start with the third story, right? The third story. There's the person's conversation or their story, your story. But the third story is that third point of view of the third person. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a third person involved in this conversation, but it's kind of leaning into, okay, there's three things happening here. This is what this person's experiencing. This is what I'm experiencing. And how do we mesh that together to figure out what this third story is that brings us to that win-win space, okay? So the third story is listen from the inside out, okay? Forget the words and focus on the authenticity of the conversation, the authenticity of each person involved in this conversation, right? And being more aware of your internal voice, because your internal voice is what's driving you to potentially say things, is driving your thoughts, your intention, etc. So being mindful of that and turn up your internal voice and learn the kinds of things that it says. We all have this premise of self-talk, the things that we say to ourselves and that voice that we hear, only we hear, right? And how does that push us? How does that drive us? How does that lend itself to our feelings? Okay. And so being thoughtful of, let me take a moment. Let me take a moment and stop here and figure out what am I telling myself? Because that's what's going to drive your participation in this conversation. So manage your internal voice and get it into learning mode. Okay. Moving away from the thought of intentions and assumptions. Like, I know what this person intends to do. I know, what this looks like, but getting into learning mode. And so learning mode is almost like this thought process of, you know what? Let me just participate in this. Let me hear this. Let me be present, right? And learn about what this person is thinking, what about this person is feeling, etc. And it goes to creating that rapport, that relationship with folk, right? We're talking about clients on many levels, but we're also talking about any difficult relationship, okay, or different conversation. Sorry, not difficult relationship, but it can be in that as well. So learning, let me take a moment and stop and figure out what's going on here, not make the assumption that I know what's going on, or respond to our activation points, okay? Responding to our activation points, setting it aside and learning. Also negotiate your way to curiosity. Okay, when we start thinking about or leaning into the leaning mode in these difficult conversations, what are we curious about? One of the things I always like to share with folk is that when we are curious about people, it lends us to ask more questions. It lends us to kind of be in that learning mode because I'm curious, who are you? What do you think about things? What are you feeling, etc. So curiosity is a good thing. And so when we tune into that case or that feeling of curiosity, I want to find out, I want to learn, it really shapes that conversation into the third story. Also, don't talk at times, right? And some of this is connected to the use of silence. Sometimes we feel like this, our activation points, and we're in this conversation, and it can be a challenging and difficult conversation. But it feels like this person has said something, and you feel the need to potentially respond to them and then and there before they even finish. Or you feel like you need to ask another question. And sometimes just sitting and just being silent, right? Just listening to let the other person know that you want to listen, but also you care about what they have to say, okay? Sitting with that, sitting in silence, okay? And it's a difficult negotiation sometimes when you're having these difficult conversations, when to be quiet and just listen, okay? And so just kind of, again, reminding you around these points. So some tools that we can do in regards to difficult or managing difficult conversations, or I like to call them challenging conversations, is to try to make it as safe as possible, no matter who you're having these conversations with, whether it's clients, whether it's significant others, other folks, friends, etc. You want to try to make it as safe as possible. Okay, so you're embracing the mutual purpose that you're coming together to have this conversation, but you're also offering mutual respect. Okay, and if you're misinterpreted, you're using a contrasting statement and state the message you're not trying to send, right? And then state the message you're trying to send. And we use this as that reframing, right? That reframing piece. So the other piece is to listen, right? Listen, active listening. There's a difference between listening and hearing, right? We hear someone say something to us. When we listen, we are actually present and plugged into that conversation, okay? So we seek first to understand, we listen with curiosity and care, and we set aside assumptions and judgments, okay? We set those aside and we listen for what's not being said. And for many folks, this is connected to the latent content. What is someone not saying? Okay, and asking more open-ended questions. And this leans back into motivational interviewing because that's one of the key tools of MI, asking more open questions, right? Tell me more, help me understand versus a yes or no, okay? And so leaning into that. Another tool is adopt the yes and stance. So the recognition that all of us, no matter who we're engaging in these difficult conversations or challenging conversations with, we see the world differently. We may see the world differently. Even if we look like each other, even if we are doing the same type of work, etc., we can still have different worldviews. And all perceptions are valid, even the ones we disagree with. Okay. And so this is about owning and stating your point of view and being open and willing to hear and accept the point of view of someone else. Okay. So like parachutes, minds must be open to function properly. Okay. Another tool is to recognize your stories. So something happens, okay, whether it's an event, a situation, etc. There's the story, our narrative, our parts of what the story is, our thoughts about the event or person are based upon our filters and our internal kind of self-talk, right? And our behaviors, our response is influenced by our story, right? But remembering if we're operating from that third story, we're taking all of that into consideration, but we're switching this to learning mode to hear about the other person's thoughts about the event, the situation, hearing their story, how they responded, and then coming to that third story space of how we can get to win-win in this difficult conversation. So the other thing is something that we talked about in this particular space, in this training throughout. That's something that we've leaned into, the use of I. I feel this way. I heard this. I was wondering, etc. Because sentences that start with you sound accusatory and blaming. Even if it's not meant to, that may not be the intention and will likely result in defensiveness, where the person immediately feels like I need to defend myself or I need to be ready, you know? This is something we want to think about. So the other tool is own your own stuff, which is always so challenging in any conversation, okay? Especially difficult conversation, and focusing on personal accountability, not blame, okay? Accepting responsibility for your own actions and or non-action, okay? And this can sting sometimes, right? Because it almost feels like you're accepting some sort of blame or you're saying that you did something wrong. That's a switch, okay? We're talking about accountability, not blame, okay? So really focusing on your personal accountability. And many times in these difficult conversations, that can go a long way in resolving some of the challenging material or challenging things that are happening in this conversation. So one model that you want to potentially think about as you lean into is state what you want to discuss. I would like to, or I want to talk with you about. Sharing a specific example. I heard this, okay? And what's bothering you? I'm concerned about, or I feel this. Describing the importance from my perspective. This is important because, okay? Or this is important to me because, okay? And owning your own stuff. I have some responsibility for this. And for this or that, I am sorry. I apologize, or I did not act. when I should have, okay? Asking for the other perspective, okay? And again, no matter how you do this, it's still because of the challenging conversation and how the other person may be responding, still checking in, right? To kind of make sure that this conversation, as best as you possibly can, is a conversation that's a learning conversation. Now, we can control our actions, right? But we also need to be aware of that people will be activated and respond based upon their thoughts, their behavior, etc. So asking for the other perspective, can you help me understand your point of view? Can you tell me how you're feeling, etc. And using the tools that you have, being quiet and curious. Tell me more about that, you know? There's something about saying to someone, can you tell me more about that? I wasn't aware of that. Those curious statements have a way of, in many opportunities and many spaces, taking some of the kind of difficulty out of that conversation. And it also communicates that you're interested in what the other person wants to say, how they're feeling, etc. Summarizing what was learned. Okay, what was the paraphrasing, right? And it's always important to kind of do that playback, like, wow, I heard you said this, and I just wanted to just check in and make sure that that's what I heard, that's what you intended, etc. And restating the importance. Okay. You also, depending upon what is happening in this difficult conversation, ask for what you want next. Let's make an agreement, or say, thank you for talking with me today, or thank you for thank you for just having this conversation. And checking back with the other person at a later time to really bring it full circle. Okay. So these are just some things that you want to think about in regards to difficult conversations. And so how do we bring this integrating into, what we've been talking about, which is cultural humility and cultural competency? It's all connected, because when we talk about MI, when we talk about person-centered care, trauma-informed care, it's all being brought into this cultural competent conversation, or how we're navigating these difficult conversations. So it's appreciating collective and autonomy. It's focusing on the person's right to inform service delivery in regards to working with clients. It challenges inequity. It seeks to understand and to be understood. Okay. It activates one's power, each person's power. Okay. Acknowledges one's truth, and it operates understanding that one's perception is their reality. You can agree to disagree, that may not feel okay, etc., but that is their reality. Okay. And respecting that is incredibly important. And it is leaning into the premise of cultural competency. Also, it's an endeavor in social justice, and it focuses on mutually positive and beneficial outcomes. Okay. So when we're integrating these tools that we either use or we're reminding ourselves in regards to difficult conversations, it really frames out the work that we're doing in regards to cultural humility and cultural competency. So what I'd like to do right now is transition over to Diana, because she's got some amazing and incredibly important information to share with you. Okay, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Big question here. How are you doing right now? Real simple. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay. So in keeping or trying to keep with that spirit, because what I'm going to cover really requires that you incorporate those concepts that Dolores just went through with you. As far as I'm concerned, we are all here to kind of just be open to these concepts, try to understand how they impact our communities so we can better be informed in how we go forward with that. So with that open-mindedness, I'd like you to kind of, please, if you can add to the conversation, that's great. If you get any kind of ouch moments, because some of these words may actually do that for you, let's acknowledge that. And that's not as bad, really, because when something bothers you, that means there's something to look at. And if there's something to look at, it's something that you want to be able to incorporate in your practice with the communities you're serving. So I'm just going to encourage you to just keep an open mind, because we're going to go through some terms here and some concepts that we're all very familiar with. And probably, not probably, I'm pretty sure because of the last 2 days that it's from different perspectives, as we've been saying right from the beginning of this training. And that's important to understand. As different perspectives doesn't necessarily mean it's my personal ideology, my own personal philosophy. It's what I need to understand to better help somebody else. So I didn't really have the opportunity to kind of personalize something or or it's offensive if it's going to stop me from being effective with someone else. If it does, then that's an opportunity for me to kind of look inside and see what's going on with me and work that out so I can better help someone else. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay. All right. Let's go through some of these concepts here. When this country first began to be colonized, and what it looks like today is certainly different, but it hasn't really gone anywhere. So racism, let's talk it. So a lot of this information comes from this critical race theory it's like a framework that looks at the legal system, the structural systems that have put together, the parameters that reinforces racism in different ways. In other words, where systems are not equitable for everyone, that people of color or people gender diverse tend to be more marginalized than other folks. And so this critical race theory is part of what the content is using to present here. And that's what the authors thought it was appropriate. And so racism itself is an ideology that gives expression to myths about other racial groups. It's actually really thinking about it's the beliefs and prejudices and certainly misunderstandings and misconceptions that are associated with different racial and ethnic and gender diverse groups. And so it's usually fear-based and more in terms of, I think when we were going over the power of pelvic, she started to give us a lot of insight as to how groups or people may feel protective in terms of not losing what they have if they have to share, of seeing other groups or other people have opportunities as they do. And so racism in terms of CRT, the critical race theory, actually looks at division and systems that are have been developed and built upon over the years that could actually create division. So it's been embedded in the structure of our society, which is what it's saying here. It's an ideology that devalues and renders certain groups inferior compared to other groups. And so it's perpetuated, deeply rooted, historically, socially, culturally, and power inequalities in society since the beginning of time in this country. It has a material foundation, and those tend to be the systemic structures that tend to reinforce the concept of division and superiority. It's also, and something we're all probably very familiar with, is how it can change over time. It's interesting to note that over history, there have been different events that have been noted and so much that hasn't been noted. And yet racism looks different today. So back in this, what was it, the 16th century, well, or I think even before that, where people were brought from Africa to become slaves here in this country as part of the labor that was needed for colonization and all the other rationales that they came up with. And so we don't have that type of slavery today, but we still have racism. So things have changed over time. Kind of depends on what's going on and what the agenda is for that time. And so it's ascribed to a degree of rationality. And the unfortunate thing about racism, it's never been based on anything that's actually credible. There's always been agendas. There's always, so when the race word was first used to justify Black or Africans as slaves to kind of nullify the what they had before. They had indentured servants. They have white folks and Black folks no, they are white folks as indentured service. It was an idea that actually came in from Europe. And so when there was starting to be some problems around the unfairness, of the housing or how people were treated, or so there was this race word that was created to justify having folks from Africa and also other how do you say, unaccredited ideas to justify keeping folks as slaves. And so white folks were started to be not part of the labor movement, and they were still poor. They were no longer treated as considered as low in the totem pole as slaves were. And so there was certain rationalities that were going on at different times that created the word, that created the justification to keep the division and see the population as inferior, and see how it's the colonies, the slaveholders and the population that was settling America, to justify them being able to hold these folks as their slaves. So it's so many different reasons depending on what's going on in history that tend to justify differentiating and supporting social inequality. And so you also have class and genders. You also have, like, gender diverse individuals have, even have this division because there's a lot of legislation or anti-legislation against the LGBTQ community. You see it in so many different ways. And so when we think about this, oh, and I wanted to put in the chat box, there, some of this information is actually, you can access in Dismantling Racism, the web book. It's a really great training when they were doing it, and they put a lot of this information online, and you can access it there. But just to continue here, further to explain, racism is ordinary, the normal way that society does business. Not very great to think of it this way, but this is pretty much the common way that has been going on for all the years since the colonization days. And so this is the biggest burden, the major burden, and the oppression is on the people of color in this country. And so racism serves the interests of both white people in power, and so those are the elites. So that makes me think of what we used to refer to as the white 1%ers, because they had the highest, they hold the power with the most wealth in the country, and also the working class white physically, and therefore neither group has much incentive to fight it. And so, and that has a lot to do, so it has a lot of intersectionality with the power and privilege piece that Dr. Blackwell covered, and a lot of the components, a lot of the concepts that we've been talking to since within the last couple of sessions. So we have social and political constructs, and race is a construct. When you think about it, there's never been, there used to be some unproven, we weren't as advanced back then anyway, but there were some unproven concepts of why there was a division and why the Black population was considered inferior. And so if you look at what the science says, and we have the best science today that we've ever had, if you look under the skin and forget the skin color, we are 99.9% biologically the same. And you look a little further, the first noted genes came out of Africa. And so some of those things are hard to deny, but a lot of folks like to cover that up. And so those racism and race, all of that social, they're just they're racial constructs created for specific agendas to achieve certain agendas, and division and oppression is part of it. And so in reality, our differences as human beings are dwarfed by what we have in common, and have little or nothing to do with personality, intelligence, and morality. So society chooses to ignore this and assigns characteristics to whole groups of people in order to advance the idea of race and superiority of whiteness. You can see in that in some of the content when we talked about implicit bias, and we think about what we've been conditioned as what is normal, what is appropriate over time. And this is decades over decades over decades. And this is learned information and learned behavior. And we bring it down through the generations. And so society has played a major part in how individuals incorporate these concepts. And sometimes it's not unconscious, sometimes it is conscious, because we talked very briefly, but we talked about overt and covert racism in the last session. The power elite racializes different groups at different times to achieve their economic agenda, to continually and repeatedly prioritize and profit over people. And so we've seen that in so many different ways. If you can think about some of the opportunities, we were talking, I think both of us were in, I think you folks were also referring to, we were talking about the health disparities. We were talking about behavioral health differences. We were talking about the economic differences amongst different groups and things that have happened over the years that have been pretty much normalized and makes it much more difficult for a person of color to achieve certain things, to achieve certain status, to access certain opportunities. So this is another concept included, the laissez-faire racism, also known as symbolic racism. And it's closely related to color blindness and covert racism. It's the idea that you can support equality while maintaining negative stereotypical beliefs about diverse groups. So it's theorized to encompass an ideology that blames these cultural groups for their own poor economic situations. So viewing it as the result of cultural inferiority and further reinforcing the need to have racial bias and racial division. And so it's totally uninformed. It's not just ignorant, it has been reinforced concepts in certain systems. And these are the systems that many of us, that we have to try to navigate through to try to access resources for our communities that we work with. So the laissez-faire racism claims to support equality while maintaining negative stereotypical beliefs about minority groups. I don't like to say minorities too much personally because minorities more in America. And I think populations should be recognized as who they are. But it supports the false idea of meritocracy, excuse me, and dismisses oppression as on the basis of racial discrimination as attitudinally and based and generally questionable. Here's the thing about that. If America really was a country where, you work hard and you can access, then there wouldn't be so much division, so many disparities, so many different levels, and racism wouldn't have all the different dimensions and unfortunate impacts that it has. And so meritocracy, I think my accent gets in the way, sorry, is based on the idea that when folks do work hard enough, they are able to achieve just like anybody else. And that's not true. As we know, everyone, I have, this is my bias. I believe everybody has their talents, their strengths, but not everybody have the same opportunities. When we think about the equity in terms of disparity, and you remember that picture that we shared with all of you. We thought about equality is that everyone has access to something. Equality, but not everybody has the card to get there. Not everybody has the insurance to get there. Not everyone can pay the copayment to get there. So no, it's not the same thing. And so even though everyone has strengths and abilities that they can use, the idea is that the opportunities are not always present evenly for everyone. And so also the color blindness, and this was part of the continuum of definitions that I covered on day one, is the belief that racism is no longer a problem, that we all have equal opportunities. Now that's interesting. Color blindness also goes into also not seeing, like when we say I don't see color, even though our motives might be, and this is, I used to hear this every once in a while, I don't hear it anymore, but I used to hear folks say that, and I believe that the intention that they were speaking to was because they wanted to be fair with everyone. Unfortunately, if you don't see color, if you don't see differences, if you're not even at the bare minimum aware that there are cultural differences, you may not be able to be tailored, you may not be able to meet the needs of that person appropriately. And so color blindness, racism prevents us from seeing the historical causes of racial inequality and how racial inequality persists in our society. When we think about, say, education system, and you think about how in different states in our country right now. We're in such a the atmosphere in this country is so tenuous. When you think about certain states who are taking away books, historical books and historical events that actually happened, trying to take it away to teach another side of history and not the actual history to developing minds, that's another way of colorblindness, racism. And it's really denoting accountability. People who subscribe to colorblind explanations claim they don't see color of people's skin, believe everyone to be equal. If you can't, there is something wrong. I don't like saying wrong. There is something that is not working, that's not healthy for a professional to see, to think that everyone has the same opportunities. That if you're not touched by that, then you're not exposed to that. This is the kind of training that helps us kind of trigger, or let me use Dolores' word, activate certain concepts in our minds, certain thinking, certain ideas in terms of what is reality in one person's world as opposed to reality in another person's world. And definitely think about what's the reality in our own world. It's going to be very different than the folks we provide services to, at least to a certain extent, because we have more access to resources than most people do. We do have our own level of privilege, and no matter who we are. And so I think the notion of fairness rather than blindness is central to all thinking today. While we address the problem of intergroup inequality and the mechanisms of discrimination as a means of perpetuating such inequality. And that's Dr. William Darity and racism and colorism in post-racial societies. I have put that Dismantling Racism webbook because it has so much information on the website, and you should really consider diving deeper into this. So the post-racial narrative denotes or relates to a period or society in which racial prejudice and discrimination no longer exist. We don't know that. We have never known that. And it's unfortunate that for some folks, for some communities or some societies at certain times, that's exactly what they think. And so the idea that you're not touching, you don't believe that it doesn't exist, has a lot to do with not looking at the evidence, which is all you have to do is just kind of just step outside your block, speak and engage with other communities, or feeling comfortable not wanting to know, which is not helpful either, especially if you're in the helping profession. And so racism is two-faced racism. There's another concept here that speaks to the difference in how attitudes are displayed in the white community when they're amongst friends, family, and other whites in private settings, and in the absence of folks who are people of color in their space. So I want to bring this up to you. This was actually some work that came out of a graduate student. I think it was part of her thesis. And so what she found is, and she had elicited and engaged and elicited some information from almost 700 people, I believe, from different people from different colleges. And so what she found is two kind of dynamics going on: the front stage and the backstage. The front stage were racially mixed social space, and white people's words and behaviors in the presence of people of color and non-racist public identity, colorblind perspective, was certainly very specific. That not appropriate for white people to, it was considered not appropriate for white people to acknowledge, discuss, or express opinions publicly about race. So folks did not put themselves in that position to even have that conversation. And so the front stage really had to do with, so when it was mixed social spaces, and this is just part of the survey that this graduate student conducted, so folks were behaving differently. But backstage, white social spaces where the interactions amongst peers or other folks who were white were more sacred. And so there were stereotypes, prejudices were reinforced within this community. Equality and justice are compromised, race-based achievement gaps were addressed. And that's meaning kind of like was more about reinforcing the stereotypes and prejudices and being safe into being overtly that way amongst other white folks. And this is part of the thesis project that this woman was working on. And so there's this thing about being politically correct. And politically correct itself has its own ideology, but there's also another, but there is often, it's really contingent upon what's the rationale of that politically correct. You're trying to be politically correct because you want to look a certain way because you don't want to deal with certain situations, but in another realm or another space, or in a protected space, you might let it out. And so what I attribute that to is for instance, what's gone on in the country for the last 8 years, 10 years, I believe that the atmosphere just got so static and so racially electrified by so many biases, discriminations. I mean, and then think about the George Floyd's, Breonna Taylor's, Trayvon Martin's, and all the different dynamics that help support and happens, and all these things that's happened. This is, and folks just being biased and racial and just overtly in your face type thing. That's been happening more in the last many years than it used to happen before. It almost seemed like we have made some progress. We have some legislation for protection. And a lot of that legislation is no longer existing. So the two-faced racism, it's really about, it's really thinking about how folks are for real with themselves or with others like themselves, and how they might be different with other people. I'm not saying everybody does this. I'm not saying not at all. But this ideology tends to play out within systems and structurally at times as well. And I'm going to give you some more definitions that kind of speak to it. So institutional racism, forms of racism that are structured into political, social institutions and discriminate deliberately or indirectly against particular racial groups. So it's routinely, systematically advantages the dominant cultural or ethnic group while disadvantaging and excluding others. Think about law enforcement, or not law enforcement, criminal justice system, and how say a person of color or offender who may more likely come from a more impoverished background may have less access to an appropriate not public defender or just an attorney, while other folks who are doing well when they are going into the criminal justice, when they get arrested, they have more the financial means to provide them more opportunities not to go to jail, more opportunities to do that. And we know that in our country, the criminal justice system has been overrepresented by the communities of color, actually more than all the other jails and prisons around the world collectively. And we have managed to do that. So institutional racism can look in a lot of different ways. And I'm sure you folks can come up with can share probably, and you can put it in the chat box, please, the different situations that you've seen with the folks that you work with or the folks that you have been involved with. So it also occurs within and between institutions. It's discriminatory treatment, unfair policies, inequitable opportunities, impacts based on race, produced and perpetuated by institutions, school, mass, and media. And so we made a big deal back in the day, and this is why it's a federal mandate, that there be language assistance services. Many people from different backgrounds. It wasn't just Hispanic, Latinx, and Latinos, and Latinas, and Latin. It wasn't just these communities. It was folks who were coming from Somalia. It was folks coming from Guyana. There was folks speaking Punjabi, and we did not, and many entities did not provide the language assistance services, and it eventually became a federal mandate. Individuals within institutions take on the power of the institution when they act in ways that advantage or disadvantage based on race. And so we are talking about how systemically, how institutions themselves actually can take on that, that approach, whether intentionally or not intentionally. Most times it's intentionally. If you're not looking, I'm going to refer back to culture of humility, where it encourages us to look within. Organizations can take a look at their policies and their practices and see whether they're racist and they're biased against communities, members of the community that there is in their catchment area. If they're not being tailored, if they're not culturally responsive, then there's a huge problem. And that can be institutional, and it's reflected in the policies and practices. Structural racism, these are also policies, cultural representations, other kind of norms work in various ways in certain settings where it reinforces um, it reinforces the racial inequity. And so structural racism or systemic racism. There are times I go back and forth between structural inequities and then I go in and I say or systemic inequities and systemic racism because I don't want us to kind of just step away from what's there, really, because when we acknowledge what's there, we can better work with it to help the folks that we're providing services to. It's the most harmful and least discussed form of racism. It codifies an individual, culture, and other types of racism in systems. And so it's like a system of hierarchy and inequity where there is parental treatment, there's privilege and power for white people at the expense of the Black, Latinx, Pacific Islander, Native American, the Arab, and other oppressed groups. And so structural racism are kind of systems that are put in place that makes it hard for folks to achieve. We think back to, I want to connect this with the how it intersects with social determinants of health. When you think about the places where people live, the opportunities to actually, to achieve a quality education, which is better to provide you opportunities to achieve higher income and eventually have a better quality of, say, of life, whether it's housing, whether it's communities, whether it's more than that. And so think of that when I go and I play and I ask Clyde to play this this video. Clyde, this is video 47, I believe. Could you do that for me?
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood, African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
So I'm going to stop right here, and because I think it's really important to understand that we all have feelings behind this, and I don't believe anybody here was born when the colonization days took over. So that means, okay, you probably didn't play a part in it then. So let's just get that right up front. The other thing is to consider is that a lot of times when this is happening, you know what happened, what I found in my world when I was working, my clients had to do with when they say certain things, how sometimes we don't believe it. Folks actually do experience these things. Many of us have experiences of this in one way or another, and it actually affects the individual. And so understanding how that can help you inform how you're going to go forward with the individual is key, you know. So what are your thoughts about the video itself? Go ahead, Brandy. Good morning.
Good morning. Um, this video, it brings up so many emotions for me. Um, and one thing that was mentioned in the video that, believe it or not, I did notice, and I felt inclined to do something different, though I don't think it was necessarily right. And that was one thing they mentioned in the video, was that they noticed that people who had more white names, or something to that effect, their resume was more often picked than someone who had a more ethnic name. And I realized that earlier on. I'm 44. I'll be 44 in June. And so I was really, when I had my children, I was really um, uh, wanting them to have things better. And so I was really mindful of what I named my girls, which is sad to say, but that was one thing that was in my mind. And this, like I said, this video just brings up so many emotions of, I shouldn't have to feel like, oh, what I name my child is going to affect them. That is just so wrong on so many levels. But yeah, I guess I kind of feel triggered a little bit, but I appreciate the video.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing and sharing with us that it did bring up some kind of emotions for you. I imagine it may have for most of us. Thurston, hi, good morning.
Yeah, good morning. So, it is not new to Black people that this is what we've been living since stepping into America. But what I fight against the most is that white society predominantly will not push back. They will go along with receiving the loans. They will gentrify. They will come into your community and change it. They will make sure that they get the lion's share of the loans, the money. They find no challenge in allowing themselves to say this is a problem in America, and then coming out to do something about it. White silence is the worst silence on the planet Earth when it comes to racism and the benefit of white silence. The concept that I have a few Black friends, or this is the saddest part of being in America, that we have to fight every day to just exist in some peace here in America. I wish that white people were reversed and they had the problem so they could understand what it means to be Black in America.
Thank you, Thurston. And I appreciate you sharing that. Everything that we're discussing here is giving us each other insight as to what can be the reality of someone's life or someone and their family, so we can better understand. And these days, what I have noticed is when you see, and then you mentioned the white silence, and I was thinking about the Black Lives Matter and how a huge advocacy group. And I started to see some different faces. Not everybody was a Black person. And so what I appreciate is when folks do get involved wherever possible. You may not be able to go do that march, but you have other opportunities within your practice, within your social circle, within your family, to actually, everyone does, to actually advocate to whatever degrees. So thank you for that. Oscar?
Appreciate the video as an adult. If I am a mentor working with the youth, I would not show them a video like that, because I feel that it sort of shows the youth watching a video like that a wall that is almost impenetrable, that they cannot climb through or penetrate, because it appears to be that all are involved in that wall, down up from real estate down to high government officials and so on and so forth. So I would want a youth that I would be mentoring, who could be Black or Latino or any other race, to feel empowered, that there is no wall, that whatever it is they want to do, they'll be able to do. And the weapons for that is going to be their interests. Are they interested in art? Are they interested in sports? Are they interested in reading? Do they like comic books? Do they like literature? So when I see a video like that, although I see that it is illustrating problems that are real and concrete, I also wonder if a minority person who either is empowered or feels empowered or the need to be empowered, if they watch that, how do they feel at the end of watching that? Do they end up feeling empowered or not? It's possible that they'll end up feeling empowered because they'll also feel, oh, well, this is out in the open. This type of racism is out in the open, and that is empowering. But I could also see them feeling dejected, like they cannot, there's no point in continuing to battle to progress if it's such a huge labor to battle. So I'm a little bit, maybe I would say somewhat not in total agreement that what one sees in a video like that should be incorporated or internalized into the feelings of a person, especially a young person or a person that is struggling through college or aiming to go to college or something like that. I would want them to feel that, okay, good video, but we have to climb, we have to move on, and we're going to succeed. So that's my view totally as I watch the video.
Thank you, Oscar. So the video is for you guys, not for the youth. So that's the one part. So that's good. But it actually showed about in history back in the, what was it? The late 40s or early 50s. I forget. We're coming back from war, and the GI Bill was allowing opportunities for certain families to actually, get the loans so they can, start a family so they can get the homes and so on. The American dream. And so that redlining actually did happen, and in other communities, the populations were not given that same opportunity, even though they were veterans too, and they were coming back from the war and stuff. And so the authors of this curriculum wanted you to remind us of different things that happened historically at different times, and how it still looks different. It can still be present today and look slightly different, but the same concept behind it. You know, and what it ends up doing is just giving division and like grouping certain people in certain places, and not everybody doesn't have the same access to anywhere they want to go. If everyone here can say, I can go wherever I want and buy a house wherever I want because I have the economic wealth, because I have the accessibility, because it's just a matter of choice, it would be great. But that's not the reality. That's just a depiction of what actually happened in the late 40s or 50s, I think. Don't quote me on that. And that's what we're trying to just show as what systemic racism can look like. And so I wouldn't show it to the youth either, unless I were to frame it, and they would be part of a course for a particular reason and an agenda. So thank you for that, Oscar. Yvette?
Yes, hi, good morning. I've seen a lot of this from childhood, from my own childhood, and it has evolved to a better place, I have to say. I wasn't here for the colonization, but I've read some of it. I'm very iffy about everything I read because a person might have been like me, or a person might have been with prejudices who wrote it. I don't know. So I read it, but then I have to feel what I think for myself as a person, as a human being, about other cultures and other people and the differences, and learning to accept them for who they are and what they believe in. It is not my place to try to change people, right? It's my place to be able to accept them, respect them, and try to guide them, if I could, to a better place, for a better way of life for themselves, so that they can believe that their change is possible. It does hurt me because I see it, and I remember being in school, and I remember, the majority of my friends were of color, and sometimes I wouldn't be allowed to go to their house because their parents had issues, not the children. Some of the children are not born with these issues. They're learned. We prejudices come from families that have gone through experiences in their life that has made them feel how strongly about saying these things, or stay away from that person, don't go over there, and that's, I take responsibility myself, because I'm that person too. But I know that if we change our mindset in this country, which is impossible because there's so many biases and so many prejudices and so many different, belief systems, but there are some that will march with us in the belief that change is possible. I've seen that as well.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Yvette. Yeah, this is all about division, oppression, discrimination, superiority over inferiority. These are part of the CRT framework that we're just sharing with you folks, because these are the dynamics that look differently but still exist. Hi, Jacqueline. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for sharing that video. I think we have to be very careful not to convince ourselves that redlining is something that happened in the past and doesn't continue to happen. It continues to happen. It just looks different.
Yes.
At this moment, my daughter is buying a house in Washington, D.C. in a historically Black neighborhood, and the appraiser that was assigned to the loan did not even visit the house in person before he assessed the value at $30,000 less than the asking price, and left off, the house has a $12,000 generator that he didn't even mention. He didn't give any value for the parking spots. And it's been a battle over the last 3 weeks for my daughter to fight for the appraisal to match the house
right
sales price because it is a fair price. And that affects not only the percentage of the amount that she's allowed to borrow, but it affects if they accept that appraisal, it affects the value of every single house in that neighborhood. And it continues to happen today.
Totally in agreement. That's exactly what I was going to been trying to stress is that it can look, we'll give you, and we can all probably think about historical events that happen. Racism hasn't gone anywhere. It comes out in so many different ways. And and so it has a different faces, the same ideology, same one. So thank you. So and I'm hoping that it all works out for your daughter anyway. She sounds like she's a fighter. So thank you. And Melinda. Oh, and hold on a second, Melinda. Thurston, you had your hand up once and then went down and went up and then went down again. Did you want to share something?
I'm vacillating, so I can't take it right now. let me just back off.
Okay, I'm good with that. All right, thank you. I want to respect and when I saw your hand. And Melinda, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was wanted to add that besides the redlining, one very prevalent thing going on now is the redistricting for elections.
Yes.
That we see the systemic racism alive and well when we're trying to redistrict so that we can cater to a perspective in the election. That they think they can force an outcome, and that is something that it has to be addressed and looked at when you're going to whatever candidate you support, but that it's a reflection of your community, that it's districted correctly, that it's respected. And that's something that, unfortunately, a lot of places are suffering from.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. That's one of the most obvious things is what they're doing with redistricting and taking away our electoral votes and that kind of thing. Thank you. Teresa, hi, good morning.
Good morning. The one thing I agree with Oscar, the point that I agree with Oscar is that it is disheartening for people that experience it every day. The value I find is that for people that do not witness it every day, it's an attempt to inform and to educate with the intent of at least initiating or bringing about a desire to make things different. The other part, I don't know whether will be brought up or not later in this session, is that many of us that encounter these circumstances have taken different strategies at changing the outcomes. My parents were able financially to move into a neighborhood where my sister and I had the advantages of a school district that had the advantages, the smaller classrooms, all of the resources, et cetera, et cetera. I did the same. I was able to do the same. I recognize that my circumstances, the circumstances of my parents, were different than many people that just don't have the ability to do that. However, having the ability to do that does not come to some degree without equally or even sometimes greater repercussions, because my experience then growing up in schools where I became the minority or was the minority, then it affects the psyche. It affects how you are treated within that school district. You may have those advantages, but you do have to grow a tougher skin. You have to shield your children against all of the things they're going to encounter. And it is sometimes a continual fight to be in that environment. And then sometimes it's all just exhausting. It's incredibly exhausting to be in these circumstances.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And I think that's a really good segue into what I'm going to present now. There are so many, there's so much of the both sides that can affect communities, individuals, families, and so on. And so on your note, let me go into how sometimes the challenges, there are private manifestations of racism that reside inside the individual. And there are people who have over time have seen that there would be more of a benefit if they didn't look the way who they were, or they didn't identify as who they were, and they were more like the dominant culture or another culture. And so that inside that internalization even takes what Teresa's was speaking to, is what comes with being able to even benefit from some of these advantages and what can happen to the individuals. I like when you said psyche, the wellness, the mental wellness, and the higher stress environment and the higher stress within the person. So individual internalizing racism occurs when a person's belief systems and stereotypes and prejudices against another race. And so it's about the internalized oppression and belief system about the race influenced by the dominant culture. Like they tend to believe it, they try to echo along with it. And so that can have such a huge impact on an individual's mental wellness and their life and their life in general. So interpersonal racism is often those private beliefs that come into interaction with others. The racism is now in the interpersonal realm, and that is between interactions with other community members, or different communities with each other, or different people with each other. So when a person is actively or overtly racist, or passively covertly racist, employs personal racism against a person of color or an oppressed group. And so that's another way of internalizing racism. So for example, public expressions of racial prejudice, of hate, bias, bigotry between individuals. When you hear those microaggressions, when you hear communities being called outside of their names, when you hear those derogatory, stereotypical frames, when you hear someone, I tell you what, even better, or just if there is, like when you hear someone make a joke off of someone else who is different than they are, and they say, oh, I don't mean anything by it, but you're making a joke and you're satirizing someone or community to make a laugh. That's another way of that's not microaggression too. And so when people kind of express them overtly and don't think it's a big deal, that's another way to interpersonal racism. So internalized racism is like when a person of color is victimized by racism, and we take it in, the person internalizes. And then it has to be understood as a system that to be grappled with by people and communities of color. So people of color's internalized racism often leads to great conflict between them. And so even within the community, it causes great stress and strife. And so that can create all kinds of challenges. You folks had received the handout for the 5 faces of oppression. We asked you to look at it, actually read it, and reflect on it. And so I'm going to read this. And if you're okay with it, I would like to take one example of each one, and not more than that, so I can stay within the timeline. So I'm going to read the first one, 5 faces of oppression. Exploitation is the act of using people's labors to produce profit while not compensating them fairly, creating a system that perpetuates class differences. Let me see, is there an example? Okay. Migrant farm workers. So thank you, Sarah, for mentioning that one. There was a time, I forget which war it was. Again, you see how some of the details are up that we can know, slavery, human trafficking. There was a time where this country needed agricultural workers. There was a huge program that the administration had created, and it pretty much lured in a lot of folks from Mexico and other places to come in and give labor. Some folks were naturalized, with citizenship, and some folks, and there was another part of it that some folks then were actually being asked to leave after a certain number of years. In certain states, it started to happen. It's really, really crazy how that happened. But it's really exploiting folks because you're using them for your your recruiting for to achieve an agenda, and then you're dismissing them. So yeah, Chinese internment camps as well. So the other one, marginalization, the act of relegating or confirming a group of people to lower social standing or outer limit or edge of society. Overall, it's a process of exclusion. What's an example of that? You can put that in the chat box too. Yeah, school segregation. That's a really good example. I will take that one. Yeah, I was thinking about that too. This USA sweatshops, even, yeah. So marginalization, well, it's a process of exclusion. It's also, let's see. So when you thought about segregation, I thought that was a really good example, because then you have the division where the resources and the quality is accessible by the dominant culture, but it's not for other folks, people of color. Massacre of Native Americans. That's cultural destructiveness for sure. Okay, so powerlessness. Some people have power while others have not, causes an inhibition to develop one's capacities. So it was that psyche that Teresa was talking about, that mental state of mind, lack of decision-making power, and exposure to disrespectful treatment because of the lowered status. So the sense of powerlessness. So I don't know if you can come up with an example for that. What if you are in a certain, no senior management representing minorities? Thank you. I was just going to go in that direction. Thank you, Lisa. And I was thinking about how some folks, over the years, we're hoping that we talk always about bringing equity into the organization too. But how many times have there been settings or certain opportunities that were granted to certain folks, but not to other folks, where it wasn't widely disseminated, these hiring opportunities? We talk about being culturally competent, even in human resources. How do we hire folks? Where do we disseminate opportunities? And how do we choose folks? All of that. And for folks who are excluded from moving up, there's a sense of powerlessness. Have you ever met someone or one of your clients who ever said, no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to move forward. It seems like I'm always taking a step backwards. So the other one, cultural imperialism, involves taking the culture of the ruling class and establishing it as the norm. The groups in power in society control how the people in that society function and communicate. Okay. Relegating people to work where they are paid less or work much harder. It's interesting. That reminds me of like when the pandemic hit and how many people had to go to work because they didn't work. They didn't make the money to keep to pay the bills indefinitely. When we didn't know what the pandemic was about, and at the same time they were risking getting sick and essentially their lives, that kind of thing. Okay, so those are really interesting. Politics, Christianity, cultural racism, slavery. So violence, the last one. Most obvious invisible form of oppression. Members of some groups live with the knowledge that they must fear random, unprovoked attacks on their persons or property. I think about the Tulsa massacre. I think about the high rates of suicidality and within the trans and gender diverse communities, especially the youth. So think about that. Violence where, when you're a person of color and you're in an area where there's not a lot of people of color, you are more likely, there is an increase, not likely that to happen, there's an increased risk that you will face some hostility. There's an increased risk, not necessarily. The perpetual hamster wheel. And so there's an array of different, examples that we still see today. So thank you everyone for doing that. That just lets me know lets us know that you actually looked at the that you actually worked to reflect on this this assignment. So the oppression is the power and privilege by socially, politically, economically, and culturally dominant groups to disempower, marginalize, silence, otherwise other perceived or indicated or dictated subordinate groups. And so I'm going to say that way because they're dictated by certain folks in power that other folks are in the subordinate category. The people themselves are not saying it, it's the folks in power saying it. So it is about social justice. It's about oppression is what happens when individuals and people discriminated against unjustly and individuals and other groups. And intersectionality, Dr. Blackwell had to explain that. So systemic oppression, we spoke about that. It's the practices, the policies and laws and standards that disadvantage particular groups of categories of people. Well, I'm going to bring it back to the work that we do when substance use and mental health and the other type of housing, the other types of services that we provide for folks. We think about how many times the experts talk about it's important to understand who your communities are. If your communities, the demographics tend to change on a yearly basis. On an annual basis, organizations should be looking to see who are the communities and what are the more common issues that they are presenting with to better inform how policies and protocols and procedures in the atmospheres and services should be provided to meet the needs of the individuals. When you don't do that, you're not meeting the needs of the community. That's part of like the systemic oppression when we are not even considering the changes in diversity and how we should be addressing those issues. And so to undo systemic oppression, forge multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual alliances. So it's a multifaceted or comprehensive approach. Create democratic processes to give voice to new organizing systems for humanity. Addressing oppression and bias inevitably raises strong emotions in clients, just like it does in us, particularly in this training. And we must be prepared and trained to address these feelings. I appreciate, and this is just for me, I'm not going to say that for you folks, but when I get feelings of uncomfortability, something's not jiving right with my spirit. There is something that is just a little off, and that is the moment where I need to take a step back and look what is going on. How let me resolve this. Am I having some issues? Because that I don't want to bring that into the realm of the interactions and the service and the support that I want to give to my clients. So the lens of systemic oppression includes individual, interpersonal, and systemic, institutional. You'll get this slide. We kind of just covered this already. From institutional oppression, this has a lot to do with how these laws have come into effect and how other laws that have been advocated and worked hard for are now have been like taken away. And so it creates these inequities. And it typically targets folks who are associated or identify with certain cultural groups. So it's a system, supposedly of invisible barriers limiting, and that's why I think CRT tends to, the critical race theory tends to help to unpack and identify points of information where, or points where we can't help but see, how these systems are starting to be more oppressing than supportive. And so these invisible barriers, and I'm not really embarrassed if you unpack them, but they limit people based on their membership. The barriers are only visible to those seemingly unaffected by it, just to make the point. And so we as providers have to be familiar with the systems and how to work with them and around them, and then get creative to help our folks. So let me go through here. Internalized depression, we talked about that. It occurs when social oppression, such as all the isms that Dr. Blackwell went over, anti-Semitism, are implanted by and work toward the benefit of the white society or the dominant group. The oppressed accept or buy into negative and inferiorizing messages that are propagated about who they are. There are some folks that identify not necessarily as their culture, but they may identify as white because they want to be resourceful. I told you about that, a client of mine who did that. But if that was a way to be resourceful and navigate through the system to access care, that just some folks do identify a certain way because they're internalizing that that's the appropriate culture to be like. And so unfortunately, what it does, it can help really try to put people in places where mentally they're high stress. That sympathetic system is always activated, and the folks living in such dynamic environments, especially toxic, stressful environments, it can further exacerbate their mental wellness. And so this has been a lot of like heavy terminology and concepts. How are you all feeling right now? Are we tired yet? Yeah, I'm almost exhausted right now. Just talking about this stuff, but that's just the reality. Yeah, feeling heavy. So this is a good time for us to take a 10-minute break and go debrief and go, just breathe it out and come back. And thank you for your courage for staying here. Appreciate that. So how are we doing? How are we feeling? I mean, this is heavy. We know this is heavy. And we were, and that's why we were very mindful in trying to help you understand it. We're going to go through some concepts and some realities that we are working with. The idea here is things have been the way it has been for a long time with different faces. And how do we look at that? How do we work with around that to help our clients? And even to situate ourselves in a way where we can put, and we're in a position to help other people. Oscar, I see your hand up. What's up?
Okay, thank you. So just one quick reflection and totally on the I. I was running multiple groups in one setting, and initially it started with diversity using the LGBTQ population as a sample. And so but it became, however, important to also give a historical view on extreme forms of racism. And we cited as those examples, for example, what occurred with Nazi Germany, especially with the focus on the Jews. And we cited examples of the Salem witch hunts, believe it or not, which lasted for about 100+ years in I think it was the 1600s. Then the Inquisition, which lasted for about 300 years. And it became important to cite those extreme examples because we did not want our Black and Latino population to feel isolated in those racisms that have existed in their lives and in their history. And we wanted to show that that has occurred. That also led into a continuation to discuss civil rights and why is it important to have civil rights. Um, Racism was defined as being intolerant and with an objective and a goal to not give people rights and to take those rights away. So that slaves, for example, became nothing more than like cattle or horses to be sold for labor because the ruling powers wanted free labor. The issue with the Jews was not that different than Nazi Germany. They wanted to kill them and to confiscate their properties. So therefore, they took away all their rights. And in fact, according to some of the studies that we did, or that I did, with Nazi Germany, they went to study, believe it or not, the African Black American slavery movements because they needed to learn how it is how do you justify removing any rights of humanity of a person? How do you argue legally that this group of people have no rights? So we did that in order to sort of give them more knowledge about how racism can operate. Why is it that civil rights are important? And so that's a reflection that I have had when I'm viewing a lot of this, that it's an ongoing battle. It's but it needs more and more empowerment and more knowledge and more education for each individual to feel. I use the word, I overuse the word perhaps empowerment, but that is very important. So anyway, that's what I reflected on briefly.
Oscar, thank you. Oscar, I think you analogically, you actually just explained what we've been doing, what Dr. Blackman and I have been doing all along, and the point of everything we've been doing here. So thank you. Thurston, you, and then I'm going to play a video, then I'm going to turn it over to Dolores. Go ahead, Thurston.
So there's a difference between all of those and historically, because slavery was an industry. It was a human industry that was used to create an American product or American products that then gave America extraordinary wealth. So it's different from Stockholm, Auschwitz. It's different from the Salem witch hunts. It's different from the Inquisitions because they did not have the same premise. Nor is racism slavery. Racism is a systemic structure that America uses to oppress, to keep at a disadvantage, and to create the hate that they continue to have for Black people. So racism and slavery are not even in the same boat. They're really not. One is industry, one is systems. And so when Oscar says that the teaching level is, I just want to be sure that Oscar teaches it this particular way because that's the way it really is.
I think we're taking opportunities here, Thurston and Oscar. We're taking opportunities here to see how history is going and how it has an impact today on people. I want to bring it back to why we're here. And it has, and I think your point speaks to something I said earlier, that it looks different, but the basis is racist all the time. It may have a different face, it may be a different agenda, there's a different goal to achieve, but the discrimination that, listen, superiority over other populations has been going on since the beginning of time. You know, we can have our own justification, manifest destiny, but anybody remembers anything about school and all kinds of rationales. The point is, some folks are deprived their rights or accessing to resources like other folks because based on these ideas of racism. And we have a lot of historical references. We also have our own, you guys as professionals working with clients directly with the communities today have your own references. Matter of fact, Jacqueline even stated one of her, a personal situation, referencing and reflecting these very dynamics impacting our lives today. So it may have a different phrase, might look different. It boils down to kind of the same thing because we have, the struggle to access, needed resources. And when we think about equity and culturally responsive care, which is what this training is about, it's about, being respectful and responsive to the beliefs of folks and be able to work within the realities of their world to meet their needs. And so hopefully this is giving us a lot of food for thought. It's certainly in creating emotions, but let's kind of channel that energy. Now we're going to go forward in a slightly different direction, taking all that we know. How do we start to integrate the realities? Now we have this refreshed awareness of the dynamics of the atmosphere of this country, of potentially, the world we live in, the ones that our clients live in. And let's start to channel this in a way where we can use this for practice. I'm going to play a video. And I'm not going to ask for process comments, but then I'm going to turn it over to Dolores and so she can go into what she has to speak of, because these wonderful comments that you're saying, all of that is so key to what we're doing here. And it's really about trying to channel that in a way that's going to help us, help our folks. And sometimes I think help ourselves too. So Clyde, would you mind playing the one I had for 62, and then I'm just going to give it to you first.
My sister-in-law, who's half Black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a safe way. one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me, and she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up, and says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just a little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you got to choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over, and she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been. She goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It is totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
So this is Dr. DuBois. It's going to be, your slides are going to have this link in it, and she's done so much work in this area. It just is a great way to understand opportunity. And how do we go forward with that? Over to you.
So now we are moving into anti-oppressive practices. And it kind of, after watching that particular video, we are definitely seeing some very, we're in that space where, okay, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? So where do we go from here? Hold on one second. Okay. So inequitable racialized outcomes do not require racist actors. So just kind of leaving and starting with and leaving at that point. And so what does this look like when we talk about anti-oppressive practices? Anti-oppressive is the work of actively challenging and removing oppression perpetuated by power and inequalities in society, both systemic oppression and individual expressions of oppression. And it's something that we consistently need to attend to in all of the spaces in which we present ourselves, okay? And each of us does it in a very different way. And there is no one right way or wrong way to actively challenge oppression, okay? There's no one right or wrong way to actively challenge oppression. In general, the community practice is about responding to oppression by dominant groups and individuals, and in social services, regulates any possible oppressive practices and helps to deliver services in an inclusive manner. That's how we're pushing this forward, right? That's how we're pushing it forward. So let's look at that connection. Oppression is the use of power to disempower, marginalize, silence, or otherwise subordinate one social group or category, often in order to further empower and or privilege the oppressor. Okay, but anti-oppression work is really seeking to recognize that one, there is no denial of oppression. It is here, the seeking to recognize that oppression exists in our society. It is here in all of its different forms, okay? But it also looks at and attempts to mitigate its effects and eventually equalize the power imbalance in our communities, okay? So anti-oppression work is about, it's here. We can think about it in all different ways, shapes, or forms. We can lean into it. We can research it. We can do all of these different things, but it's here. Now, what do we do about it? Right? And those, the practices or the anti-oppression work does not always have to be a large change. Okay. It can be a micro change in regards to how are you working with clients, okay? It can be focused on a particular policy in an organization, etc. It can be just using your voice in those spaces and places where you see something happening that does not feel right, that disempowers one group and silences a group so that another can feel more empowered, okay? So when we talk about an anti-oppressive practice or anti-oppressive practice, sorry about that repeat. You want to lean into a couple of things. One, thinking about, have I ensured the actions that I have taken, that's a me, that's an I, are equitable, collaborative, and power sharing, and how can I measure this? Okay, and our work with clients and our connections with folks, what have I done? Okay, have I been responsive? Have I been collaborative? Have I been coming from an equitable place? Have I been power sharing? And this is something that we consistently need to lean into because earlier in the training, I think it was day one or day two, we talked about power, right? And leaning in and acknowledging that there is a natural power imbalance when clients come in to see us or we go to clients' homes, etc., because we have information, we have resources, we have all sorts of things that a client may need. So acknowledging that natural power imbalance is there and mitigating the impact of that on the relationship in that interaction so that we are not perpetuating oppression. Okay. So if yes, how can I promote these anti-oppressive actions at an institutional or systemic level? And if no, what do I need to do differently? So it's also leading into the premise that this is not something that we do on a one-to-one, right? Even though all of it is amazing work and something that we consistently need to engage in. But how do we look at this in the space that we find ourselves as employees, as staff, as providers, etc.? I can definitely control what's happening on some level, how I am conducting the work and the anti-oppressive work in my interactions with my clients, right? Because I can control that. But how am I then impacting and facing and challenging oppressive practices at an institutional systemic level? And if no, what do I need to do differently? So with all interactions and situations, have I thought about my power? Have I acknowledged privilege in all of its different forms? Because there's the privilege that we recognize and there's the privileges that we don't recognize, right? And so we need to unpack all of that and social location and how it impacts my actions. Again, it's coming back to that thought of who am I? What do I represent? What potential privileges do I have, etc.? And how is that bringing itself into the room? How is it bringing itself into how I present to the world? And how does all that interact? Have I questioned and challenged dominant ways of thinking to transform power towards equity? Whatever those actions are, okay? Is it about talking about a policy that you're like, this doesn't sit right with me? I think a little earlier, Diana, you mentioned about the different ways that folks responded in regards to the murder of George Floyd, right? Some folks marched, some folks signed petitions, some folks did a number of other things, right? That there is no one action that is better than the other. What we're talking about here is action, okay? We're talking about action. There is no magical kind of, this is number one, the best action, or number two, this is the best action, or the second best action. It's, are you acting when you see it? Are you acting when you hear it? Okay. So 4 questions to ask yourself. Okay. These are things just for folks to think about, and just taking a couple of minutes to put some of this information in the chat. When you get into these spaces and places, asking yourself around, around this conversation about race and oppression, because that's what we've been talking about, what Diana's been talking about, right? Asking yourself, I don't care who you are, asking yourself about this. Am I trying to change the subject? Am I using inappropriate humor to deflect this conversation? Am I getting defensive or angry? Or am I going out of my way to not focus on the negative? Okay, these are questions that we want to ask ourselves. And so as you're kind of leaning into these questions just for a moment, I'm going to ask for folks to please type some of this information into the chat. Okay, because while we may not be able to lean into this, because remember, there's a lot of unfinished business that we're going to have based upon the information that we're sharing, this does not negate the fact that you will continue to process this information, hopefully, whether it is through verbalization or it is writing it in the chat. Okay. So I'd like for folks to take a minute to look at this particular diagram and think about not just yourselves, but think about the organization or the institution in which you are affiliated with. And where does it land in this continuum of race-focused work? Are we talking about colorblind or diversity only or race tentative or equity focused? The institution, okay, the institution, okay? And I would like for folk to share some of that information, what they feel comfortable in sharing, of where they feel like the institutions that they are currently involved with, where they are landing in this continuum, okay? So I'm gonna open it up to a chat. Give it a moment, and then I'm going to kind of switch and stop sharing for a second. So I'm gonna stop the share now so that we can really have that face-to-face or that contact when folks process this. And again, you can share what you feel comfortable in sharing, okay? Either verbally or via the chat, and that this is focused on the institutions that you work in, okay? So is there anyone who would feel comfortable in sharing?
I think that I live in the community I serve. Okay. I live in what people call lower income, economically disadvantaged, Black and Latino neighborhood. The organization I work for is based here. And it's difficult when you have people from outside of this neighborhood coming in and using terms like, well, the people here, they need to pick themselves up by the bootstraps. They need to, this and that, because right now we're having a syringe problem. There's syringes everywhere. We have a needle exchange program, and they're not it's not truly an exchange because the needles aren't being brought back. And so we were discussing, you know, the agency handing it out has to be more accountable. Please be transparent with your data. And that wasn't occurring. And one of the comments was, well, the community should clean up. The community should do it. And, you know, I was like, as a Black woman, I got to tell you, the community is tired. The community is doing everything they can to get their kids to school. The community is doing everything they can to put food on the table. There's a real food disparity and housing disparity going on right now because rent's going up. And it made me very defensive and emotional because the people on the other side of the table proclaiming to come in a helpful equal term were, you know, they just weren't getting that. They weren't seeing the community. It became, you know, well, obviously this is a community that doesn't care. This is a community, you know, if they did, they would put more effort into this. And it's like the community is fatigued. Um, we have endured a pandemic, you know, where so many of our people died. We have endured, you know, just all the different racisms and just inequalities and health disparities. And so it's been it's hard because we try to move forward and create hope and keep creating a program, but it's hard when within your own agency you have people that go, well, you know, these are the bad guys. These are, you know, you have gangs in your neighborhood. And it's like, yeah, we do, but guess what? The majority are not. The majority are just people that are working. So it's to say it's ouch is right on the pulse there.
I'm not sure how to put this inside the work, but so where I work, it is very diverse, but it is very the people of color are the predominant people in the workforce. But right above that, in the administrative force, going up to the executive force, is all white. So I don't know what that looks like, but I could tell you kind of like what is said about that experience. It's almost plantation-like in the sense that the ceiling stops at a certain place and the diversity does not rise through the ranks. It rises to a certain level, but after that level, everything beyond there is the traditional white America viewpoint. But it's people from all over the world, and specifically brown people from all over the world that work for the organization. So I don't know how to place that in a place. It's just what I think. It's just what I know has happened.
Yes, yes. And you don't and I think Diana dropped this in the chat that this is something that while you're looking at it for the purposes of today, this is something that as you continue to unpack and lean into the unfinished business of this training opportunity, is that you're going to walk away with some things that you're going to really need to get into to figure out where this lands. And so it's okay to not be sure of where this is or what this looks like or putting words to it. Because again, this is a challenging journey. And it also requires us to begin to really think about this information, to really think about it and process it and come back to it again and process. And then there's the other piece of then what do we do about it once we figure out where we land? So again, coming back to that premise, like we are going to continue to have unfinished business here, but being okay with that and also being motivated to move past it and continue the research, continue the work. Okay. So thank you for that, Thurston. Charmaine?
Oh, yeah, hi. So let me just say this. I see these types of racist and prejudiced attitudes throughout, especially the Caribbean communities. So one thing I've observed since we've had a lot of gentrification in Brooklyn, um, a lot of us Caribbean folks have been getting a lot of somewhat like harassment or calls when we have our functions. We have been having our functions in Brooklyn for years, especially coming closer to Labor Day time. And we have had to put up with our Caucasian neighbors not understanding the culture, calling the police on us many times. And this is an event that happens, like, let's say, around the year, and it brings in a lot of money into New York City, especially Labor Day time. So what I have done in collaboration with some other organizations, such as Prospect Park Alliance, and if you are in Brooklyn, please join Prospect Park Alliance, to bring about some more awareness and education to the neighborhood, especially for Caribbean American Heritage Month, which is in June. We do workshops to try to educate, and we include and we invite all those in the community to come in to understand what the Caribbean Carnival culture is about and what lessons they have to teach us about life. But you find that type, I don't know, it's a onwashing of the brainwashing, so to speak, I need to say, because you cannot come into a community and not try to understand the language and the culture of the people that's living there, and then you come and try to extort or implement your attitudes. So that is something that is quite prevalent in what we notice. Even in my neighborhood, I went to buy a gallon of water where I was paying a particular price all the time. And as soon as the gentrification increased, they raised all the prices of the food products. I said, why? Why are you doing that? Because a particular race of people moved into the neighborhood and you assume that because they are here, you have to raise your prices. So you see it in all different types of ways. So I yield my mic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And just kind of circling back, and thank you for the responses, and thank you for the responses in the chat. Being okay with this feels ouch. Ouch. Because it goes back to, once you acknowledge certain things, the next piece is, what am I going to do about this? How am I going to participate in this or not participate in it? Okay. And what does that look like? I'm going to go for one more person before we move forward. Tracy?
Yeah, I hear what everyone is saying. Have worked for the state 35 years. You see the racism, and I believe now it's worse than it was when Cuomo's father was in office. You could just see it. The level of the gentleman said how you see the minorities are the workers, but the policymakers are white. And it's very frustrating because they don't understand the services. All they know is this is the policy you have to implement, but they never take time to really understand the system in which we all are employed by. So for me, I'll keep it on the eye. It's very frustrating to see the changes and how it affects us, especially for a woman of color. Again, I stay on that because it's real how statistically we are more educated than our counterparts. And that's something I didn't make up. That's something that's been documented, and how I've seen the challenges, how they really challenge you. Like, you don't know what you're doing. And it's for me, it's draining. It's toxic. It's like, look, this is a job. We're all here to do a job. Please don't think you're better. And I have a policy that I live by. I never say he or she's my boss. I said, this is the supervisor in which I work with, because you're not better nor as knowledgeable, because as a supervisor, you're supposed to encourage and empower and enrich your team. I don't see that when it comes to white women. That's all.
Thank you. Is it okay if I just reframe something a bit, Tracy?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. I just, for me, and just for the sake of the space and hope and possibilities, right? Kind of remembering that Not everyone is all of anything. And so while we may definitely have very challenging experiences with institutions and different folks in the community, that we also need to check ourselves to make sure that we're not making the assumption that everyone is always something. That was just kind of where I kind of land, because as we go into the next piece around allies and accomplices, right? We have folks who are allies. And so we always want to acknowledge all of the different moving pieces and layers to this continuum. Okay. I just wanted to kind of say that. Is that okay?
No disrespect for you. I think that's fine. And I'm going to put a twist to it. In my journey of working, and I emphasize 35 years with New York State, 35 years. I've given them 35 years. Yeah, there may be allies, but within those allies that I've encountered hidden agenda.
Got it.
Hidden agenda. So that's why I put it that way.
Okay. Thank you so very much for sharing. And also, thank you for also acknowledging that's your experience, and we want to respect everyone's experiences here. Thank you. So I'm going to move us forward a bit because we're running a little bit short on time. So I want to make sure that we, get through as much of the material as possible. So I'm going to share my screen again. And again, you can continue to participate in the chat in this ongoing processing of this information. Okay. So hopefully I can share without another challenge around this. We're going to see. So hold on one second. Okay. So some of the things that we want to lean into when we're talking about this is to leaning into the premise of how do I become an ally or an accomplice, right? How do I become an ally or accomplice? No matter where this is landing, okay? And so some basic tactics around that is assume that racism and oppression is everywhere, every day. Okay? Everywhere, every day. And noticing in these spaces that you find yourself, who is the center of attention and who is the center of power. Okay? Remember, this happens it can happen overtly and covertly. So we need to be able to acknowledge all of the different manifestations of this. Noticing how racism is denied, minimized, and justified is also a part of this. And understanding and learning from the history of whiteness and racism. Okay. We also need to go back to and lean into the intersectionality of this. So understanding the connections between racism, oppression, economic issues, sexism, and other forms of injustice, as Imiranda mentioned in her community, right? And also taking a stand against injustice, however that looks for you. Okay, however that looks for you. We also want to be strategic. Okay, being strategic and really thinking about this action, this, me being an ally, what does that look like? And can I be an ally all the time? Or being strategic in how you do it? And don't confuse a battle with the war. Okay, this is not a one-off thing. Like this one battle is one battle, but the war is a larger context of racism and oppression that exists. Okay, don't call names or be personally abusive, and support the leadership of people of color at the different spaces and places that we find ourselves in institutions. Okay, and don't do it alone. There is power in numbers. Okay, so gathering colleagues and peers and saying, we need to address this, we need to do something about this, is an important aspect that can be so incredibly helpful and so effective. And talk with your loved ones about, and individuals in your social circle about racism and oppression. okay? Talking about it and not hopefully being in a space of denial, okay? Oh, 1 second. Okay, so how do we start leaning into some of this? Cross-cultural communications. You know what? Do we need to take a quick break, you think? I know we just had one. Do we need to take a breath moment? Just a breath? See people go,
How do folks think about that? Thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yeah, just a breath, a couple of breathing. Let's see, where are we landing? I see people doing, huh?
Thank
They're
you,
looking like, huh?
Ashley goes,
Huh?
Okay.
Huh?
I say let's do it so we can come back and end on a high note.
Yeah, I mean, I understand, folks are like, well, look, we've got to 1:30. We have time, but it's important for us to also take care of ourselves in this, right? Because you're getting hit with some heavy information here and a lot of information to process. So we're kind of heading into our final stretch here, and we're going to be doing some work around just breathing because there is hope with all of this. There is hope. Okay. So you want to take 10 minutes, Diana? You think that's fair? Okay, let's do 10 minutes and then come back and let's keep moving, but also tap into hope and possibilities.
That's
Okay.
right. Okay, 10 minutes. See you guys in a few.
I hope everyone had an opportunity to take a breath, have a quick cup of tea or whatever that grounding opportunity you needed for yourself. Because again, there is a recognition that this is some very challenging material, that there is going to be unfinished business, that there are going to be multiple activation points that we need to acknowledge and process. But at the end of the day, also making sure that we're okay and we're taking care of ourselves, because we're not going to be able to resolve this all in one day, right? This is going to be an ongoing journey. And so just reminding ourselves that this is going to be a journey. This is going to be something that we're constantly plugging away at. Also for folks who may be activated by any of the material that we are talking about or you're seeing in the chat, being okay with taking a moment to ground yourself. We're heading quickly towards, we're heading towards the end of our time together, but the end of this journey is nowhere near. Okay. So just kind of being okay with that. So I'm going to share some information with you, and then we will then transition over to Diana. So I'm going to go through this information fairly quickly because I want to be able to leave space for us to kind of ground ourselves and be okay. So give me 1 second. Let me share my screen. Hopefully it works this time. How about that? Because my computer's been acting up. Okay, so let me share my screen. And here we go. And remember, you'll be receiving a copy of the slide deck. So even though I'm going through this fairly quickly, you will receive all of this information and you can take the time to also look at it, process it, and take it in, okay? So we're going to be talking about cross-cultural communication with the context of cultural competency. That was a lot of C's, okay? And so what we're going to be doing is just leaning into some potential strategies that we can talk about. And so communication strategies. So regardless of how much we know, and there's a lot of brain trust in this room, in this virtual space, or what we think we know about an individual receiving services when entering a new setting or working with a client, professionals must first listen and learn before acting. And so that brings us back to those difficult conversations or conversation, right? Being in a learning space. and learning about folks and learning about their experience and then potentially responding. So the following actions can promote some cross-cultural communication, because remember, communication is a reciprocal process. So understanding that individuals are vulnerable. Everyone who is coming to us is in a vulnerable space. Okay. And vulnerability looks different for different folks. But the very premise of asking for help is potentially vulnerable. And so being respectful of that, employing or deploying skills of empathy and cultural humility. Okay. Empathy is something that is embedded in everything that we do, the attempt to understand. And the cultural humility is us taking a moment to not only attempt to understand, but also learn and know that we don't know everything. Okay. And being okay with that. Being open to learning more about the individual, because you are not the expert in their culture. And you may be coming from the same exact quote unquote culture that you assume. You may make that assumption, but everyone has different experiences. And so really the only expertise you're bringing to this in this communication, this reciprocal conversation or conversations, is being an expert listener, not hearing, but actively listening and communicating with respect and appreciation, and being aware of the characteristics that are important to the individual. Respect and appreciation is something that goes so far. And when people are sharing, when folks are sharing what's happening for them, or they're sharing their story, they're sharing their negative, all of what it looks like, to say thank you for sharing is just such an act of empathy and kindness. Okay. Hold on one second. Hold on. Here we go. All right. So there's a couple of models, just two models I want to talk about fairly quickly to continue this process of cross-cultural communication. And so there's the learn model and the respect model. And these are two kind of common frameworks to highlight culturally responsive motivational interviewing strategies. And they're really helpful to remind yourself of, okay? So the learn model of cross-cultural communication is to listen with empathy, active listening, okay? Not just hearing, but listening. Explaining your perceptions of the problem. That's circling back and really leaning into, this is what I think I heard. Is that correct? Just a simple statement such as that, okay? Acknowledging and discuss the differences and similarity. This is that learning component, and that there are going to be differences and there are going to be similarities in your experience, and being okay with acknowledging and putting all of that on the table. Also recommending treatment options that are based upon collaboration. And this can be really challenging sometimes because you may be in a particular setting that only offers one type of treatment option. And so what do you do from there? What does the client need? Okay. So recommending treatment options based upon collaboration. And sometimes that might lead to you recommending other options. Also negotiating a process and considerations. What is this all going to look like? What is the process of this? What do we need to consider? And you notice I'm using the word we, right? Because when we're talking about cross-cultural communication, when we're talking about communication period, it is about we. What are we doing together to help get to the space where hopefully we would like to get to? Okay. So another model to kind of think about this is respect, the building of rapport, which is an ongoing task. It's not like the first time you see someone that you're building a rapport, and the recognition that this takes time to do so. The clients that you may be working with, this may be maybe one of the first times in regards to engaging in this particular institution and this program, etc., that someone is asking questions, is being culturally humble and asking and leaning into who they are as individuals. beyond the presenting challenge that they come in with. So this is ongoing, okay? Empathy is also ongoing. The attempt to understand. The attempt to understand is something that we lean into in all aspects of our work with clients, okay? It's not we understand, like session 3, we understand, we got it, okay? And so being thoughtful around that and being plugged in and really creating an environment of empathy and support, okay? Support in regards to the work that you're working with together, but also tapping into community supports, etc. Because all of this kind of brings us into a partnership with the folks that we're working with, right? So that partnership is not just us and the client. We're not the only two members of this partnership. It could be family members, it could be community stakeholders, all sorts of folk, okay? And also explanations. As we move along in this process, it doesn't mean like, okay, hand something to someone and not provide context, not provide information, etc. Okay? We're doing informed consent along the process. We are respecting folks' choices. We're respecting what they want to share, what they don't want to share. All of that is a part of this concept. Also, continuously engaging in cultural competency, responsiveness, and humility. Okay. Again, this creation of this environment of working with folk is not just the 1 to 3 sessions. This is ongoing work with folk wherever you are and landing. Also, the building of trust. Any relationship, cross reciprocity, cross-cultural, is about the building of trust. That's one of the cornerstones of much of the work that we do, that we trust our clients and they trust us, that we will be present, that we will not do harm, etc. Okay, and so leaning into that as well. So the respect model is a good way to continue to do things that I know that I'm pretty sure everyone out here is doing. Okay. So some cross-cultural skills: use asset-based perspective, or using an asset-based perspective, which is strength-based, right? Maintaining boundaries is incredibly important because that also brings us back to connecting to trauma-informed care, motivational interviewing, etc. Having appropriate boundaries. Respecting the perception of folk, okay, that we can agree to disagree at times, that different folks have different perceptions, and hearing that, listening to it, and being respectful of it. Cultural communication in regards to communicating with folks in the language, etc., that they feel comfortable in communicating with. Trust, of course, and the interpersonal and task completion communication, right? Which is, what are we working on here? What are the tasks we're working on here? And what are we working on here as individual parts of this collaboration? Okay. So what does some of this look like? Well, what does some of this look like? It's integrating the client's culture, okay, by exploring culturally relative themes through questions. We can then begin to more fully understand clients and identify cultural strengths and challenges. So it's not about the assessment where you're asking a series of rolling questions like boom, 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 boom. It's asking these questions tactfully so they don't sound like an interrogation, okay? Trying to integrate them naturally into the conversation rather than asking them one after another. And not all questions are relevant to all settings. However, words can be adapted to suit clients' cultural context and communication styles. Also, when we're talking about engaging clients, we play a vital role in ensuring that this is a fulfilling and encounter where they feel respected, hopeful, and understood. And so for some clients, the initial meeting is often the first encounter with this organization and or system. It might be, okay? For some, it may not be. But that initial meeting is so incredibly important because it lays some beginning foundation, okay? So whether it's the initial meeting, the first time they're coming in contact with an organization or system, or this is ongoing contact. We want to hopefully create a space where folks feel respected, hopeful, and understood. So it's up to us as service providers and staff members to establish a first impression and begin building their relationship. So imagine one's whole being in a greeting, thought, body, attitude, and spirit is most engaging, okay? I always like to say, particularly when I'm doing some trauma informed work, by the time the client gets to you, they may have come in contact with 5 other people. So what does this look like on ongoing practice? Okay. So acknowledging client strengths and supports earlier rather than later. It's not kind of at the end. It's kind of doing that as an ongoing process. So strengths and supports to explore is pride and participation in one's culture. And these are just some examples. Social skills, tradition, knowledge, and practical skills specific to the client's culture. Bilingual or multilingual skills, traditional religious or spiritual practices, beliefs, and faith. Generational wisdom, okay? Generational wisdom is one that is so powerful. Extended families and non-blood kinships, ability to maintain cultural heritage and practices, perseverance in coping with racism, all isms, and oppression, and culturally specific ways of coping, and community involvement and support, okay? So when we're talking about screening and assessment, as we're kind of coming to that space where we're going to, transition over, is beginning to think about, before selecting a screening and assessment tool, ask and answer, has the cultural applicability to the client/patient been evaluated before use? And what is the normative data for the specific population of the client? Because we know, based upon quote unquote data, results can be inaccurate due to differences in culture and beliefs. Okay. And if you're utilizing an assessment or screening tool and you feel as if, you know what, there's something missing here, or can we look at this? That's an opportunity for advocacy. Okay. That's an opportunity to impact what is happening for clients in your care and taking it to from a micro level to a higher level policy and procedures. Also, effective screening and assessment tools will take a multi-dimensional approach to understanding the role of culture in clients' lives. So effective use of a culturogram tool, mapping of the role of culture, will assist providers in understanding the unique attributes that influence patients' lives in a cultural context. Also, if folks have heard of a genogram, that's also another opportunity to really lean into some of this. Also, acknowledging the patient's socio-cultural background and understanding and incorporating relevant cultural factors while avoiding stereotypical one-size-fits-all. There are folks here who are trained in a variety of different approaches. Let's take that for example. MI does not look the same for every person. Okay, and being able to make those adjustments for true individualized care and connection with folks. Mitigating negative influences of poor and decreased cross-cultural communication. Another 3 C's there. Okay, so that's mitigating the negative influence of that. Not just acknowledging it, not just participating in it, but decreasing it as much as you can across the board. And so finally, providing support that is culturally competent and in a language that ensures the client's understanding. So the assessment and the tools should include shared decision-making approaches, of course, using health literacy strategies in all form of communication, and confirms understanding of all points of contact. This goes back to our forms being offered in languages that folks are in the community speak, right? Instead of the translation piece sometimes that happens, because we know that things can sometimes get lost in translation. Offering tools or having assessments, etc., in the language that folks feel most comfortable. And if we don't have access to those tools, having the language line and other opportunities to communicate with folks in a level of comfort that they feel comfortable with. Okay. So I see that Jacqueline and Katie, I see a couple of people raise their hands. So I'm going to stop my share because after we answer a couple of those questions, we're going to transition over to Diana. Okay. So I saw Jacqueline, I think you had your hand raised.
I did. I just wanted to caution us. We're now on the advent of AI, and it is so easy to have AI translate a document for us. And some of the translations that come out, if they're read by a native speaker, are positively laughable. You know, even extras. I mean, we buy things from evidence-based evidence-based programs, and they've literally translated things and they don't make any sense. So it's almost worse. I say this as a Latina. To me, I'd rather don't put it in Spanglish or don't put it in some of what you think is Spanish. I'll translate it myself, or I'll ask someone to translate it for me, than to have some of the things that I've seen.
And you bring up a great point. Knowing the tools that you're utilizing in this process is key. Knowing the tools, just because it says it's evidence-based, just because it says it's anything, we can attach a number of labels onto any of the tools that we utilize in our work. But have you looked at it? Have you gone through it? Does it make sense to you? Is it accurate? Is it accurate? Okay, and accurate for the community in which you are working with and the cultures you may come in contact with. So thank you for that, Jacqueline. And AI, yes, a big one. It's a big one. Thank you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now transition over to Diana, who is going to really help us lean into some more content and also take us to that grounding place, okay? Diana.
Thank you. I just wanted to kind of segue off of what Jacqueline said, because just recently, so I do trainings and supports in Spanish. So one of the strategies that I use, and we did have an official source translate the materials, but I use certain strategies to make sure that it translates appropriate, that everything is tailored to the community. Because this is not new stuff for me. This is kind of the things that we try to practice what we preach around here. So I had to translate. I knew that the community I was going to, and I'm very familiar that in that part of the Bronx, I'm a Bronx girl, and in that part of the Bronx, they speak Spanish in a certain way. So I had to take the Spanish translated materials and retranslate it appropriately, conducive for the providers in that area, and those who work with certain communications with the communities there. And so I totally get what Jacqueline is saying, but we have a whole thing about we have to provide language assistance services. It's more than just knowing how to pick up that phone or just getting an interpreter. Is understanding some other dynamics, some other factors that make it tolerable to the communities. You have to know your community. It's really helpful to know the diversity within different communities, because it's not just Spanish, is it Swahili, is it Punjabi, is it one of these other languages, and what dialects, and so much more. And so it really benefits us when we take the extra steps to tailor it specifically. So that was just a strategy that still helps me today. And so let's talk about some more strategies. This is the really good part. And I'm going to go through a couple of slides, and then I want us to go through the homework assignment that you were given. Really appreciate, folks. I hope you get them all in. We want to make sure you have the 15 hours. So if you haven't turned in assignments, please send it to Tree. It's not too late. But everybody Dolores and I were reading the different responses that you folks gave. So this is a good time to go over that. And because that's a real positive note to kind of say, okay, now we went through all this stuff. We got some feelings out of this. And that's just our experience. Imagine our client community. So now what do we continue to do with it? So Dr. Blackwell just went over some strategies. And I just actually just shared with you a strategy that I use because the language issue that Jackie brought up. And so let's talk about a few more in the sense of what you can do back at your agency immediately. You don't have to do this in 6 months. You don't have to convene a whole big committee. I say, what can you do within the next couple of weeks? What can you commit to including in your practice and further informing your colleagues, the leadership, and everyone else there so we can continue to enhance our service delivery and so much more. So let's go over this. Thank you. So stigma reduction strategies. So prejudice and discrimination contributed to people's wellness and people's mental health and substance use problems. So we know that stigma, unfortunately, it's not so much that people want to keep it a secret, but it's the fact that they know they can be ostracized, they can be ridiculed. It's often the oppressive or the lack of resources, all those dynamics, along with the stressors of having to deal with certain situations, that really keeps somebody from even accessing care. One of the biggest things that we started out with in the beginning was the stigma with people who have mental health or substance use problems or both. And so that issue about stigma, which happens to be like one of the top 3 identified barriers throughout the last couple of decades of research and data surveys that have been gathered. And so the idea is how this impact of folks and why, if they do engage, if they do access care, how we might want to account for this potential aspect in terms of how we engage, how we interact, how we support. And so it helps people. And unfortunately, stigma impacts individuals in such a way that they'd rather not seek care. Think about the environments they live in, and think about the high stress with different challenges, and how do they seek care without feeling that they're going to be judged or knowing where to access. So mental health and substance use conditions are less likely to get better, of course. The conditions get exacerbated without intervention. Very rarely do folks, although there are instances, but many times folks are not necessarily have the capacity to do on their own any better than what they're already doing. And that's the whole idea, is accessing support from us. So they can isolate their experience. It's not drug abuse. The substance use, the suicidal attempts, teen pregnancy, which is not as high as it used to be, but sometimes teen pregnancy can be a result of family dysfunction and other issues. So the idea that life can seem hopeless to some folks. And so this whole thing about stigma is about the negative things that other people in the media say about them. And when we were talking about internalized racism and internalizing the negative connotations that are associated with someone who uses substances, with someone who has mental health issues. We do a lot of training around wound care, particularly because the opioid overdoses not only are fueled by fentanyl, but have been the last couple of years, we've been seeing a lot of xylazine and also skin ulcerations, and the stigma has just risen even that much more. And folks have a hard time even getting help from the medical community because of how they're judged or how they're treated. And so it keeps people in isolation and keeps people in a space where things can get that much worse. And that low self-esteem of guilt and shame is so internalized to a point that it's hard to think that there's something that life can get better. Without hope, what happens with a lot of folks is there's no reason, there's no motivation, there's no reason to move forward in any kind of way. And that's why, this is why you folks do what you do. You're the ones that make a lot of difference in an individual person's life. And it has to do not just how you interact, but the supports that you give them. And so I know this is from the slides themselves. Talking about language, we're going to talk about this now in the assignment. It says here, be sure to taste your words before you spit them out. I'm going to talk very specifically about why we have this language matters slide. And so it's come up in your strategies, in your assignment, and we'll talk about it more specifically. So here it is. Here's the assignment. All right, so please add your comments. And the idea with this was to understand. So now we got all this information. We're really aware. So some of these are suggested strategies to augment what Dr. Blackwell was sharing with us. And so what can you realistically think about committing to doing? And the reason why is what you can commit to doing, because without your commitment, your business, your practice will go exactly the way it was. This training was not just about getting 15 hours of KSATs or CPP or CPS credentialing. This training was about raising awareness and prompting motivation. And that's the whole thing behind here, because we can, in our own capacities, can do a little bit more. So let's start off with saying, well, know the facts, be inquisitive. Remember that this is culture humility as part of the title of this course. It encourages us to be more other person oriented. That's person-centered care. And so person-centered care means we don't work off of what we know, what we think we know, as we elicit the information. So now, so understand what mental health or substance use problems is looking like in the other person's world. We already, as professionals, are required to be trained and have our credentials based on the information we have that on our education, but it's a matter of how we tailor it according to the needs of that individual. So understand how substance use mental health interacts specifically within the reality of that person's world. So how does culture can help how you inform, how you go forward, and how you support them. Then culture humility also speaks to us self-reflecting, the need to do that. We get conditioned, we are so prompted with so many different things. You folks have to facilitate groups, make sure all the data is good, all the data for every progress note, for every file is entered in by a certain time. You have to meet with clients, you have to do resource matching, you have to do resource accessing, you have staff conferencing, you have so many different things to do. And so that can actually impact how we present with the client community. So understand how that might even put us in a place of higher risk for our own belief systems and our own biases to actually come out, and both in our practices and in our words. So it says here, choose your words carefully. And that's where that slide of language matters comes in. It is not just understanding what is the best language or the preferred language of the individual. It's about understanding what our goal is, how we're helping folks, whether it's behavior change around substance use disorder or substance misuse. Know the difference between the two. We've got plenty of trainings on that. Understand what different mental health issues are, trauma and stress related issues. Understand these different dynamics that may be impacting persons, and understand how to translate that and have a conversation about it using a recovery oriented perspective, because we don't want to use any more stigmatic references. I see substance abuse and I see substance dependence. We don't say substance abuse anymore. That was changed more than 11 years ago. So if we're still in the habit of doing that, that was appropriate back then. We really need to change it. And I'm very well aware that our colleges, our universities still use the term substance abuse. I'm encouraging everyone here to translate that to substance use. And I know that because I'm an instructor at NYU, and I know a lot of the other programs still use the terms. The terms have been outdated for a while. What that does is it helps us commit to be more intentional with the wording, with the references, and that reinforces it within our own minds that we're really speaking to a person with a health issue, as opposed to using terms that have been associated negatively, particularly as part of stigma. It is something that we don't want our subconscious to, or our unconscious bias to be activated by. So the other thing is about educating others. I like that. Be aware of my own attitudes and to strive to choose my words carefully. It's just a matter of like just thinking for a couple of seconds and being more intentional. That's a nice habit for us as professionals to have. And so instead of just going kind of off the cuff because of what we're used to, it's not that we don't have knowledge. It has nothing to do with that. It's that we commit to be more engaging and more culturally responsive to individuals. And that's the whole thing about that. And so whatever we learned before, we could simply unlearn and replace it with another habit, a healthier habit. When we know more, when we know, we can do better. And so, so thank you for your comment. Let's see, what's this? This is Janelle, thanks. So educate others. be a agent. Find opportunities to pass on facts and positive attitudes about people with mental health and substance use conditions to the community in your circle of influence. And so when it comes to advocacy, and Dolores was talking about this, we all have opportunities to inform people around us. Many times, like the client community often does not get information unless we give it to them, but we can have that opportunity within our family circles, social circles, our community circles. We can actually provide information to help inform other folks too, because that way we can, we can actually create communities that are more informed and can be more supportive. So focus on the positive, strength-based approach. Always with strength-based, one of the things I spoke about and was that culturally, when you are eliciting information from the other individual, it's not so much that I have to actually agree or disagree with whatever anybody says. It's that I have to understand how that works for them in their world, how that affects decision-making process, how that might be used as a strength, how certain ideas, whether or not I agree with it, has nothing to do with it, because I'm trying to help me, I'm trying to help the other person. But it's the idea, it's certain ideas and philosophies that I can elicit from my client. I could reframe in the context of supporting that individual so they can achieve their highest levels of wellness. And that's the idea there. So we want to focus on the positive. The health conditions are just one part of who they are. There's a lot of other dynamics. This is a good time to remember the chart of the social determinants of health. What we do is maybe between 20 and 30%, but there's a whole other 60, 70% of their life, of the realities of their world that is impacting them too. So how can we integrate that to support them better? So, speaking of supporting folks, people with mental health, substance use, or co-occurring disorders need to be treated with dignity and respect. And this is something, this is something that you folks already know. I will reiterate how I define respect, which is really understanding their ideals and how they see their world, their strengths, their resources, their education, their perspectives, and include that. So to me, respect is not just being rude, is also eliciting that information and integrating it into supporting them. So also stigma reduction includes, it is against the law for employers and people who provide services to discriminate against people with mental health and substance use problems. I know this is not something that we consciously do, but if we take a step back and look and self-reflect every once in a while, the way cultural humility encourages us to do, we may find that we might be a little different with some folks than another. And so that's just an opportunity for us to say, oh, maybe certain things are swaying me a certain way. Let me realign myself. And so that's just a human thing, but it's something that can be mitigated. So treat this like any other illness. So here, so substance use and mental health issues of any kind, it's even folks, even when we think about language, I mean, it's really important. I said, even schizophrenia, I've heard folks talk, well, I have a client who's schizophrenic. There's no such thing. There's a client that you might have that has schizophrenia. There's a kind that might be actively using, they don't have a dirty urine. Really making sure that we commit to saying things differently will take some energy, which raises our awareness, which reinforces looking at folks with health issues that we're helping them with. So the cultural humility and cultural competence piece is really about, let's reflect on personal cultural values and biases and belief systems and our own heritage and how we evolve. Because all of that, how we're influenced over time, what we still adhere to since childhood, or all those different influencing factors of time that we can be aware that have made us who we are today, are the same dynamics that are happening for any given person you're providing services to. So it's really helpful for us to understand who we are. And that way, we're more likely to not see that person or meet someone new through that lens with those belief systems of ours. We really need to see the belief systems of that individual. So actively engage in lifelong learning to understand cultural preferences, worldviews, choices, decision-making process. That includes, I identify as a Latina. That's just the phrase that I like. I can go into it a lot deeper, but just in general, that's what I'd like to do. I know that I cannot assume that every person that is female, that of us is Latina, is just like me. Couldn't be further from the truth. I love that we're all a world unto ourselves, and there's opportunities to support everyone. Embrace diversity, equity, inclusivity, health promotion, health care for individuals, diverse geographic, cultural, ethnic, racial, and gender, racial, spiritual backgrounds across the lifespan. Isn't that interesting? So that's definitely a mouthful. And even like that, with those identified domains, there's still so much more because they're varying degree and different levels of adherence for any given person, let alone any given community. And so we spoke about this at length with the client. Protect the client dignity. If you're doing, I have to do an ethics training soon. Client dignity is part of our ethical responsibility. We have to ensure that, and we don't want to be dismissive with some folks, and then very active with others. And so everyone deserves the same respectful approaches. And so demonstrates principles of person-centered care and cultural humility. We don't know everything, but we do have some skills that we can use accordingly. And that's the whole idea here. Can we commit to being comfortable with not knowing, so it can prompt us to ask questions, so we can understand the other individual and be able to look at ourselves in that process, so we can work off of what we are eliciting. The whole thing is about rechanneling our energy to promote, to support, and to elevate our communities. And we can do that. So a couple of things I wanna go to before I get to anything else. I want you folks to give yourself grace. So this is something that Dr. Blackwell and I spoke about. This is not the easiest training to participate in, but it is one of the most necessary trainings that we have to participate in. All of this is in your humanness, and allow yourself some freedom to just be, because your own self-compassion is essential for self-care. I always tell everybody that's an ethical responsibility too. You have to take care of yourself. And it was mentioned before. You have to be in the position to be able to support others. You can't really be culturally responsive and compassionate with others if you are not practicing self-compassion, self-care for yourself. So some of the things we could do is practice simple breathing exercises, making eating well and getting quality sleep, remaining socially connected for self-support. Can everybody just take a deep breath just now? It seems like the perfect timing to do that, okay? So if you don't mind, you don't have to, but if you can just follow my lead, let's do the breathing at least twice here on this platform. All this information and all this stuff is in our heads. In order to process it, you have to kind of come down off of it. So what I'm going to suggest for us to do, and I'm going to walk you through, I'm going to ask you, when you're ready, when we're ready, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, and then I'm going to ask you to breathe in, and I'm going to ask you to hold it, and then I'm going to ask you to breathe out. When you do breathe out, you breathe out as slowly as possible, like a whisper, okay? All right, and we're going to do this twice. All right, everyone, close your eyes. Very good. Now take in a deep breath, slowly and inside, and count to 5, 4, 5. Hold 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let it go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, now one more time. Breathe in. Breathe in the calm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold it. Breathe out the relaxation. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Open your eyes. There is something so fantastic for when we detach for a couple of minutes, we regulate our body systems, we come down physically so we can come down mentally. Whenever you feel anxiety coming up, do it with your client communities. Do it whenever you just had an encounter that increased your stress level. Take deep breaths, let it out slowly. Your heart automatically starts to slow down. Everything starts to come down. It is such a wonderful, almost magical way to kind of get in the moment. So with that, I want to make sure we are stopping here right now. Just want to remind you to give yourself grace. You can't do this kind of work if you don't take care of yourself. And we really, 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 you have no idea as trainers how much we appreciate you being here, participating, listening to all this, and getting through all this. So really appreciate that. So this is a good time. We want to give you a few minutes to kind of just share your comments, because we're going into a Friday. We want to not carry a load. We want to lighten up. And so this is a good time to kind of share your comments and thoughts.
So quickly, I just wanted to share one thought. Well, a couple of thoughts. This has been extraordinary. So thank you for everything. I really, really appreciate it. It was painful in a lot of ways because I live it every day. But it was helpful to really see the work that we can do with the clients and how we could help to change their lives and how they can influence our lives through the exchange of the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. Because hopefully most of us love what we're doing and we understand the power of what we do. So thank you for increasing my power, and thank you for giving me much more than I could have ever imagined that I would have gotten in this experience. So it's been great. So thank you for that. And I just want to share one thing about the spork, the bathrooms. Okay, so I just want to go back to that. So in that illustration, the thing that I recognize is that the spork was designed for neither one of those. That's not what spork is designed for. I understand the analogy, but the spork had the choice for either one because the spork was designed to be the spoon and the fork. So I don't know if the illustration works for me in that way, because when I see the spork, I'm going, okay, so the spork, personal design, what it's supposed to be used for, it didn't matter what bathroom they went to, as long as the spork understood what its design was. It didn't matter what bathroom they went into. To me, they could have gone into the spoon, they could have gone into the fork, because it's a spork. And its design allowed it that flexibility. Its design allowed it that choice. So the illustration didn't work for me.
Well, thank you for that. We can do a whole 3-hour, 6-hour training just on that one image. And we can unpack this some more. And I'm gonna kind of just leave it right there because there's different perspectives that kind of go into whether the sport does have the access or not. So I like the way you said it. I would think that. The problem is that I don't think everybody else, not everybody else would agree. So they might be challenged, But I agree with you. They should fit in either place, and it depends on that. So good. Any more comments? Any more? And thank you so much for everything that you added, Thurston. What else? Any other comments? Any other thoughts?
Diana, we're definitely getting some comments in the chat.
I was hoping some folks will verbalize it.
Yes.
Yeah, I see that folks think it's a great training and the awareness is there. Please don't stop at awareness. It's a great place to start, but there's no action behind it. So let's move with it. Let's move forward with it. Okay, so I see Oscar and then Brandon. Oscar.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Dolores. I do learned a lot here, and I appreciated everybody's comments. I think that I would like to idealistically see more of this, particularly if something like this can occur also in the media, where where higher government officials and persons from Oasis, for example, and many other professionals, they could actually meet to talk about many of these issues. Because I think that we need more of that. We need more sports figures, for example, more people in the entertainment industry that are in power and can be mentors in high schools, for example, for these persons to step up to the plate. So I look at this wonderful experience as something like we said before, and like you, Dolores, said before, and Diana said before, that it is an ongoing process.
Yep.
But in looking at it like that, idealistically, I would like to see it being inspirational to others that are in high command and power to implement greater changes, in addition to the work that counselors and social workers do.
You know, Oscar, we are hoping that you and the rest of the folks here keep taking the word out and keep practicing it out. The more we can spread it, the better. Thank you. Brandy.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed this training. I would say this is probably out of all my years, 20 plus years, in doing what I've been doing, this has been one of the more impactful trainings that I've had. And so I appreciate that. I really appreciate the governance of the meeting, how you all handled the meeting and guided us through them breathing activities, breaks. I appreciate that. Acknowledging our viewpoints. I appreciate those. I really like that. But one question that comes to my mind is how the meeting would have been handled should there been a facilitator who had been white. How had the meeting had gone? And that just comes to my mind. And maybe to add someone of that persuasion to the meeting to kind of just see how it just, it kind of comes to my mind. I see, you two facilitating the meeting, but my mind just kind of goes to how the meeting, how more impactful it would be had we had someone um, from that persuasion.
But thank you, Brandy. Just so you folks know, every New York State OASIS trained a bunch of folks. Most times we develop our own courses based on the research and based on the needs that you folks identify. This was facilitated and trained by OASIS, and you have a whole selection of all kinds of trainers that actually have been training this virtually and in person throughout the state. So that does exist. We just happen to work for the same organization and wanted to pair up. Thank you. Melinda?
I just wanted to say thank you, and because this gives you it one, the information is so impactful and eye-opening, and of such hopeful value, because when you're in the struggle and you're day to day and you're trying to, bring to attention, respect people's pronouns, respect people's culture, respect, bring a genuine caring and empathy. And you may be faced with a person that, well, I've been doing this for 25 years. And as you said before, I see addicts all day. And it's like, that's not compassionate. That's not empathetic. They have a disease. You wouldn't treat a person dying of cancer this way. They're dying slowly, okay, due to a substance use or a disease that has tricked their brain into thinking, I need more. They need our support, and they're a human being, and you have to meet them where they're at. And to constantly sometimes feel like you're in that battle of, it's substance use, it's a disease, have compassion. Sometimes you get sad, you get a little demoralized. This kind of training coming out and hearing the information kind of be here, this is here, it's established, this is the accepted. We are going to accept people's pronouns, we are going to accept people's cultures, we are going to bring that out to the community. It reinvigorates you to keep speaking, as we would say, truth to power. So
like
thank you for bringing the training, and keep offering it and keep bringing it to as many people, because we'll keep sharing it. It'll invigorate us to bring it forward too. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Dolores, last words.
Oh my gosh. I think
Oh, we got Tracy. You want to wait for just a second?
yeah,
Tracy.
sure.
from you.
I,
Go
I, I
ahead.
I know I haven't been on camera, but let me just say,
That's
you
okay.
two ladies are phenomenal. The patience, the compassion, and the empathy just to hear us out and non-bias. Let me just say thank you. I've been coming to this program, oh God, almost 10 years. And it's been phenomenal. It really has. So let me just say thank you to both of you. You guys are wonderful.
Wow, that was nice. Thank you, Tracy.
I think, did Brandy have her hand raised or did she drop?
No, she was copying.
Oh, okay.
Brandy just spoke.
So thank you it seems like we've said thank you, but it just is so gracious of you all to share this part of your journey with us. This is not an easy space, and it leaves you with a lot of unfinished business. But you have all been so gracious in sharing and caring for each other, in the way that you spoke out. The folks who were in the chat putting amazing information reflections in the chat. You help us make this training what it is. Because because we're talking to the void. I like to call it the void because if folks, sometimes it's the virtual training sometimes is not as sometimes powerful as the in-person training. Well, especially when we're giving this information. But you guys knocked it out of the park. And thank you so very much, because you helped make this a training that was helpful for everyone who's in this space. We appreciate you all so very much. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for caring. And the only thing I can say is please have a good weekend and do something fun. Let this information go for a little bit. Just let it go and go do something fun for yourself and for your family. Okay?